Sometime in 1908, two very high masts appeared in Jedrick Street, Randwick, and eventually wires formed into long cages were stretched between these masts, which caused me to wonder. This, I discovered, was the first experimental wireless telegraph station of the late Reverend Father Shaw.
The ABC Social History Unit presents Bright Sparks, Australian radio stories, compiled by Stephen Rapley. This first program, The Wireless Priest.
He's a boy from the bush, very rough and ready, that's what his own words, rough and ready, but I do try to do my best. He's a simple sort of man and a very, very good man in many ways, but not a man wise in the ways of the world. He went his own way, did his own thing, and expected other people to accept the doing of his own thing.
Long before radio broadcasting was even thought about, the new mysterious technology of sending signals through space without any connecting wires was a constant and noisy issue on the Australian political agenda.
Look at the top of the line of the bricks. It's just like in the photo.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
The top line of stones.
That's right. I'm sure those old buildings were all part of the original thing.
And that was what in the original layout? The infirmary? The sanatorium?
Sanatorium, I think, yeah.
And now it's a powder magazine.
I don't know what it is now, it's a magazine of some sort.
From the moment news first arrived in Australia of the earliest wireless experiments of Heinrich Hertz and Guglielmo Marconi, local scientists and experimenters across the continent began winding spark coils, rigging aerial systems, and stirring up the ether. A Catholic priest, Father Archibald Shaw, who got his wireless experimenter's licence in 1910, stirred up so much trouble that it led to a royal commission, the resignation of a senator, and the sacking of a minister. Wireless was first used for communication between ships at sea and radio stations on the coast. Early development of the technology was stifled by a stranglehold over patents held by the major companies, Telefunken and Marconi. When the first two coastal radio stations were set up in Sydney and Perth, the successful tender was from the German firm, Telefunken. But later, because of the Labor government policy favouring Australian manufacturers, Father Shaw was to supply the equipment for the next 17 stations. Father John McMahon is the archivist at the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart in Sydney. Recently he took me on a tour of the site of Father Shaw's wireless station and the wireless factory, Australia's first, in the Sydney suburb of Randwick.
Where would he have been operating the transmitter from?
I think he would have operated from the top room of this building here, in that corner room there, I think.
And this is Ascot, the house they lived in?
This is Ascot, the house that Father Shaw and Mr. Kirkby and his two sons actually all lived in this house here, together with the mission procurator, who was Father Gui at that time. Father Shaw was the assistant procurator, and they all lived together in this house.
Was it normal for lay people to...
Oh, no, most unusual to do that sort of thing, but Father Shaw had a very liberal interpretation of rules, shall we say, and he believed in having his workmen living on the spot, and they didn't have a place to live at any rate, so it was convenient for everybody.
So it was charity more than a business arrangement?
Oh, no, it was a practical arrangement, I'd say, and he was quite happy for them to live there, but I don't think his confreres in religion, especially his superiors, frowned a bit on this sort of arrangement, I think, and they made it clear to him on various occasions. He was on the outer a bit, you know, with regard to his religious superiors, because he's a very unusual sort of man. Very unusual sort of man.
Tell me what you know about him. The character.
Well, he's a country boy. His mother and father died very early. He was only about 8 or so. And the family brought him up. Various relations. He went from relation to relation, I think. And he went to school at Tumut, which is not very far from Adelong, where he was born. But he had a very tough existence, I'd say, and a few photos I have of him show him to a real typical Ginger Meg schoolboy, of the day, and not clothes not very good. I don't know about having shoes on his feet, but he had that sort of existence. He lived very harsh life, and he brought up very harshly, I'd say, too.
How was it that Shaw first started making radio? Was that an experimental thing that he did in the evenings?
Well, first of all, Father Shaw had to raise money for the missions. He'd worked in the missions as a young man for a year or so, 2 years. He came down to Sydney to continue his education and finish his education so he could be ordained a priest. He was ordained a priest in 1900, and he was the first Australian-born priest for the missionaries of the Sacred Heart in Australia. So then he was appointed procurator of the missions. That meant looking after 3 tremendous missions. There was the French mission in Papua New Guinea, what is now Papua, and also in Rabaul, was staffed by German missionaries of the Sacred Heart, and a 3rd mission in the Gilbert Islands, staffed by French missionaries of the Sacred Heart. And Father Shaw's job was to coordinate all the effort to send materials, medicines, building materials, food, anything was needed for the missions. Father Shaw's job was to assist the procurator to send those materials to the missions. Well, he tried to never had enough money, of course, so he had to try to raise some money by painting. He'd paint enormous canvases, 10 feet by 10, and sell them. He used to get about £50 for each canvas, and he had a bit of success, but obviously there's no money in painting. They weren't original works. There's nothing creative about it. He did copies of old masters, of resurrections and crucifixions and angels and all this sort of thing. And he used to sell these things and raise money for the missions. But after a while he realised that there was no money at all in this, so he decided to investigate the possibility of wireless. He'd been interested in wireless since he was a young fellow. He'd worked in the post office in Goulburn, and he was interested in wireless, and he decided to try and make wirelesses. So, purely by accident, he came across a chap called Mr. Kirkby. Kirkby had 2 sons working with him. He had I suppose he'd be an entrepreneur or manufacturer at this stage. And he'd actually make the instruments, and Father Shaw would draw the plans.
In no time at all, success crowned our efforts. Mr. Kirby then asked my consent to make up these instruments for public use, and if he sold any, I would get half the profits. If there is none sold, the men lose nothing, as they are not depending on them for their daily bread. If there is a sale, the men get half the profits and give us half. I may state that the timber merchants gave me timber to build my masts, and as I was already doing good work in wireless, and on that account got a certain amount of publicity, so that when a storm came and blew down the masts, people came and offered me money, Catholic and Protestants, to put up a steel tower.
Do you think Father Shaw had a flair for publicity, for public relations?
No, I don't think so, really. If anything, I think he was inclined to downplay this area. For instance, there's an article in the Daily Telegraph that you will have read in which his name is not even mentioned, even though it's all about him and his works. He's not the one to push his own barrow, as they say, but he didn't mind having the reputation of being a wireless expert, if you like. I suppose he'd take a legitimate pride in that sort of thing.
The Daily Telegraph story in February 1911 was headlined, "The Biggest Station in Australia. Tower at Randwick 250 feet high." A few days later, there was another photo featuring Father Shaw, Kirkby, and more than a dozen of his apprentices at the base of the gigantic antenna tower. With Father Shaw, they'd all volunteered to come to the rescue of the missing administrator of Papua, Staniforth Smith. Shaw knew Smith from his time in Papua and took his team to Port Moresby to put together an ambitious network of 6 wireless stations to guide the search. But before it was all finally set up, Smith and the remnants of his party returned. 2 years later, when the Port Moresby coastal radio station went on the air, it was one of the 17 other stations around the country equipped with wireless gear made at Shaw's Maritime Wireless Company in Randwick.
2 rotary spark gaps with 30 and 36 teeth, respectively, mounted on insulated base and enclosed in soundproof box. 1 tuner, comprising 3 condensers and 2 transformers. 1 anchor gap, 1 magnetic detector, 1 tuner, receiver and telephone shore system. 3,000 feet antenna wire.
Now, the other thing is that there seems to be a bit of antagonism from the order, from the local people in the order to the work he was doing.
Yes, this happens sometimes. Father Shaw was very much approved of by Cardinal Moran, who was a great man for the worker, the working man. At least he gave out that impression to people. He's also genuinely, I think, trying to better the conditions of the worker. But he also is a great believer in clergy and priests being scientific in their work and being scientists even in their work. And he was very much in favour of Father Shaw continuing with his scientific work in wireless telegraphy. But his own local clergy, the missionaries of the Sacred Heart, who were doing parish work, pastoral work, and the work that a priest has to do, they felt that this scientific interest and this interest in wireless telegraphy was taking him away from priestly work that they thought he should be doing.
I am aware that some of the fathers do not like me working wireless for fear it might bring trouble through the Cardinal disapproving of it. I thought it my duty to see the Cardinal on that point, telling him everything and that perhaps it might bring in a little money. He was delighted and gave me his blessing, saying that if I needed any little financial help, his secretary would assist me. He also hoped that I would make it a life study, as he wished all his priests to be leaders in science and to help in every way the working classes. When going to New Guinea to help find the lost governor, His Eminence sent for me again, giving me his blessing, asking me all my plans, etc., and said when I was leaving that by this action I was raising the priesthood and the church in the eyes of the government and the people of Australia.
Shaw was enjoying great technical success. He had the support of the Fisher Labor government, who favoured the Australian company over its German and even British competitors. While Telefunken and Marconi took Father Shaw to court for violating their patents, the Crown Solicitor not only fought the cases for him, but even guaranteed to pay all damages if Shaw lost.
Certainly had a personal relationship with one senator in the cabinet in Melbourne, and that was Senator Long. And Senator Long's son was working in his wireless shop, or in his wireless works at Randwick, and he shared with Senator Long a certain interest in racehorses. That wasn't because he lived in Randwick, I don't think, but he and Senator Long and Enred used to pick winners in Melbourne, always in Melbourne racecourses, never in Sydney. I don't know why. And he was very friendly with Senator Long, and Long was very good to him.
The patents battle was eventually resolved, but Father Shaw's wireless works were to suffer from something more damaging. Labor lost the elections in June 1913 to Joseph Cook's Liberal Party. Labor didn't regain power until September 1914, just after the outbreak of the First World War. But for Father Shaw, it was too late. On the 3rd of December that year, Shaw's close friend, Senator James Long, proposed the setting up of a government-owned wireless works.
There has been established for some time in Australia a factory specially equipped for the construction of wireless material. This factory, I'm glad to say, received considerable encouragement from the Labor government when they were in office from 1910 to 1913. It was in consequence of the support received from the Labor government and the activity displayed by that government in linking Australia up with a chain of wireless stations, and those interested were induced to import special machinery at a high cost to equip their works thoroughly, so as to undertake the manufacture of wireless plant and material. But when the Labor government was superseded by the late Cook ministry, strange to say, every effort was made to boycott the works. I make bold to say that during the regime of the late Cook government, that factory, with 250 skilled, capable young Australian workmen, didn't receive 6 penn'orth worth of government work. Not only did the late Cook government not encourage this fine Australian industry, but they did all they could to place obstacles in its way and to assist its competitors, known as the Amalgamated Wireless, a combination of the German Telefunken and the Marconi companies. The Australian interest of those companies was combined for the purpose of defeating the Commonwealth system, an Australian invention that was assigned to the federal government without any cost to the country. And I regret to say that this movement, in a great measure, succeeded. When the war broke out on the 5th of August this year, there was considerable demand for wireless plants, and the then Minister for Defence purchased a number of them from the German company, while hundreds of young Australians capable of manufacturing them were walking the streets of Sydney looking for work.
Father Shaw found himself in a liquidity crisis. At the same time, antagonism from within his own order increased.
To make matters short and clear, were you to order me to leave the Procure, I could not attend to the wireless, and without me the company would break up. And I would have it on my conscience. Also the £20,000 the gentlemen have put in my patents. So I would be placed in a very awkward position. I'm doing my best under very trying circumstances, and it is often 2 a.m. in the morning before I get to bed, and turn out at 5. But I'm not doing it for myself, but for the Procure.
While the money from the government suddenly dried up, his suppliers demanded payment, and his finances were in a state of confusion, both the wireless works and the missions.
Well, his superiors in Rome sent a visitor out to investigate the whole question of the Shaw wireless works, and they found that it was chaotic, that he had been mixing up money for wireless with money for the missions, and he had used a lot of money that was meant for the missions, the 3 missions that he was supposed to be looking after. He was using a lot of that money to buy material for his wireless works. He thought it was a good thing because he was on the crest of a wave, as I said, and his future was assured. So he said, "Oh, it's okay. I'll be able to get that money back very easily." But that's not the way business works, because all the money that the profit made from selling wirelesses, all that profit was ploughed back into the business to make it viable. I mean, there's no way it could support itself. You had to plough money back in. So eventually they reached a stage of complete chaos. And Father Shaw signed a document to the effect that £8,000, that's pounds sterling, of course, in those years was quite a bit of money, £8,000 of mission money had been spent on buying a wireless equipment. So having signed that document, he was told by his superior, by the visitator, to sell the whole caboose.
Father Shaw was to spend the next and last 2 years of his life negotiating the sale of his maritime wireless company to the Commonwealth Government in Melbourne. Eventually, in August 1916, with Long's help, he sold the works to the Navy for £57,000. Cut off from overseas supplies of wireless equipment because of the war, the Navy was keen to make its own. Shaw's competitors, Amalgamated Wireless, were amazed at the high value placed on what they claimed was a factory full of obsolete equipment. From the moment Father Shaw withdrew the money from his bank in Melbourne, the story took a mysterious turn.
He stayed at the Coffee Palace Hotel in Mufti. He was travelling on business, and at that time, of course, it was a big deal getting £50,000 sterling for anything at all. And he travelled in Mufti, or in disguise, if you like to put it that way. And the local priest didn't know he was there, certainly. And he got the money and banked the money on the Saturday morning, say, and he immediately paid cheques which were traced soon afterwards to various creditors, people he owed money to in the business world. And then he withdrew one cheque for £5,000 sterling, went back to his hotel. He met Senator Long and handed over to him some of the money that he received as a kind of a payment, as Senator Long said, I think, for his kindness to him. Then he went back to his hotel, and he was found the next morning unconscious on the floor. As far as I know, he remained in a coma until he died.
Many facts didn't emerge until 2 years after his death, when a Royal Commission set up to investigate the administration of the Navy focused their attention on the Navy's purchase of Father Shaw's wireless works. Shaw had cashed a cheque just before he died for £5,300. No one knew where that money went. James Butchart was the bank manager.
He came to my room, as far as I remember, with that money in his possession. And he had told me he was leaving for Sydney, I think the next day, or possibly the day after. So I said, "Surely you're not going to Sydney with all that money in your possession. Let me give you our bank's cheque in exchange for the notes, as that will be much safer." He put his hands on my shoulder and said, "Mind your own business," and smiled. And I think that is where our conversation ended.
Several people alleged that Shaw paid over £5,000 in 4 sealed bundles to different people for their help in the sale. The main target of the Royal Commission was the Navy Minister, Jensen.
Jensen was to me, it seemed a very honest sort of chap at the Royal Commission and afterwards. I find it hard to believe that Jensen was crooked. But Long, I think, would stretch a point to help a friend.
Senator Long admitted to the Royal Commission that he'd received £1,390 from Shaw as a repayment of loans and a token of friendship. When they searched his accounts, they found that a couple of weeks after this, he banked £2,400. The extra £1,000 was explained as unusual luck at the racetrack.
Do you remember Father Shaw coming to see you at Parliament House on the 19th of August, 1916, or any other date in August?
Possibly he did. That's the date upon which I received money from him. Is that a Saturday?
On the 19th of August, there was a cheque drawn by Father Shaw for £5,300. It was a Saturday.
I saw him on a Saturday somewhere about that time.
Where?
At Parliament House.
Whereabouts at Parliament House?
In the Senate club room.
Was anyone present in the club room?
No, that is to say, after the messenger who showed him in.
Was Mr. Jensen in Melbourne on that date?
I couldn't tell you, presumably.
Was Senator Gardner in Melbourne on that date?
I have no idea.
Was Senator Russell?
Well, no idea.
Did Father Shaw give you anything?
Yes, he gave me some money.
How was it done up?
Just in a roll of notes.
Was it done up in a packet?
No, just the notes rolled without any covering whatever.
What did he say to you?
He said to me, "Thank God I got the whole thing fixed up. Look, Jim, old man, I'll never forget you for your kindness. I don't know what I owe you, but I think this will square us." He handed me the money. I was sitting in the big chair and he half embraced me and left the club room. I never saw him afterwards conscious.
The Commission's findings were handed down. Long eventually resigned after a futile demand for a judicial inquiry into the purchase. The Order of the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart were not represented at the Commission, and neither was Shaw there to defend his reputation, which took a battering.
Royal Commissions are strange. Nobody really can be pinpointed. And you can't drag out the truth from people in a Royal Commission. You can say what you like. And some of the accusations against Father Shaw, they could have been true, particularly with his personal dealings with people, his personal relationships with Miss Evie Hode, for instance. What she says is uncorroborated stuff. But, I mean, you've got to accept the fact that she probably told the truth.
Did you see Father Shaw again?
Yes. He said he was going to try and sell to the government, and that he would have a little trouble, he thought, but thought it would come off.
He said lots of things.
He said it would get Long and Jensen to work, and that he did not think he would have any trouble in getting them to sell.
Now, what were the exact relations between you and Father Shaw?
He had asked me to marry him 2 years before he died, and he was just waiting until he got everything settled up.
How long had you known him?
Well, my father had known him since he was a boy. I knew him since March or April 1913 or 1914.
And was it in 1914 he asked you to marry him?
The ABC Social History Unit presents Bright Sparks, Australian Radio Stories, compiled by Stephen Rapley. The second program, Ship to Shore.
And time moves on. Nothing. except the derisive scream of the wind. 12:30 noon. What was that? A little click. Several. Regularly. The letter S. And again. Marconi heard them for some time before he trusted himself to hand the telephone to Kemp for corroboration. Could he hear anything? Yes, he could. Then the faint sound ceased, significantly.
The scene is Signal Hill, Newfoundland, on the 12th of December 1901. The central character, Marconi, listening for the 3 Morse dots of the letter S being sent from Cornwall.
The tremendous expanse of ocean had been bridged. What must have been his feelings at this supreme moment? The achievement constituted an epoch in human history. The lives of millions, of every race and creed, would be affected as from this hour. The commercial possibilities were incalculable. The mitigation of loneliness was certain. Continents would speak with each other of their several aspirations. A ship in distress in the perilous wastes of the seas could be succored. Lovers, separated by a hemisphere, would confer privily and be comforted. Empire builders, isolated in desert and jungle, would hear the sounds of their cities and be cheered and refreshed. A new world would be born.
That dramatic reading recalling the beginning of international wireless telegraphy is from a promotional record for the Marconi phone brand radio being sold in 1935. Radio was first used for shipping communications. The Marconi company was quick to establish a number of coastal stations on both sides of the Atlantic. They sold wireless as a package to ship owners, which included the equipment, the operator, and the access to shore stations.
All ships, this is Adelaide Radio, Victor, India Alpha, final strong wind warning, just issued. Listen to Adelaide Radio now, channel 67, 2201 or 4428.7.
The push for a network of maritime wireless stations to be placed around the Australian coast was prompted by concerns as much about the suspect intentions of German neighbours in New Guinea as the safety of the large numbers of people travelling by sea. In 1909, shortly after the Waratah sank in the Indian Ocean with all 93 passengers, most of them Australian, the government began plans to establish its own coastal radio stations. By the time the First World War began, there was a chain of 19. The coastal radio service was the beginning of radio activity in this country.
I was just a skinny little kid, you know, just gone into long pants. And he said, "You're going to work here?" I said, "Yes." "Yes, sir, yes." He said, "What's your name?" I said, "Ellis." He said, "What's your Christian name?" I said, "That is my Christian name." He said, "Well, what's your surname?" I said, "Smelly, Smelllie. He said, "What?" I said, "Smelly." It was the first time I'd known that that name was different to anybody else, because it was so well known in Bridgewater that it was like Jones or anything else. And he roared out laughing. What a hell of a name to go to bed with.
Ellis Smellie was one of the first wireless operators with Australia's coastal radio service. His training in telegraphy began with the post office at the age of 12. In 1906, he joined the Victorian Railways.
Well, the next morning, the station master, a Frenchman named Gallard, a great big tall chap, very, very polite, and he ignored me, completely ignored me, and I sat on a stool for about an hour. And then the telegraph line started and called Witchyproof, and he answered, and I went over and took down the messages, quite a large number of messages, because we had to relay to Sea Lake and us further on. And he couldn't believe his eyes to see me sitting down there, little skinny little kid, taking the stuff by sound. His whiskers came over my shoulder 2 or 3 times, and when I finished and gave OK, he landed me one on the back. "You're a sound reader, you're a sound reader. This thing's driven me mad. I've been all day long reading the tape and taking the messages off the tape." And he said, "You're a sound reader." Oh, the top brick of the chimney was mine from that day, that moment on, because I could do all his clerical work. All he had to do was to sell tickets and take the money. I had a wonderful time at Witchyproof.
After working all over the state, Ellis Smellie graduated to Spencer Street Station. It was while he was working here in 1911 that he first heard about wireless from local experimenters. Towards the end of the year, a chap named Jimmy Brown came to work there. He told Ellis about the coastal radio service starting up. Jimmy Brown had been in charge of the Marconi station at Sciasconset in America. After Brown was hired to set up a station on Thursday Island, Ellis Smellie joined him there at the end of August 1912.
Of course, the mast had to be erected. You had a mast, I think it was 187 feet long, and it was built of wood. Big long sleepers, they looked like, great long, or about 15 up to 20 feet long sleepers. Now, all dovetailed in so that it made a perfect square. Now, I guess that square would be about 15 inches square. And there were spikes put in. You climbed the spikes. And I loved going up those spikes. I'd go up there for exercise at any old time and have a look from the top. Beautiful sight from the top. The island was there. Over on one side where the ships came in, you had Good Island and Hammond Island. On the other side, you had where the quarantine station was. And then there was Prince of Wales Island. It was about 12 miles by 16 or something like that. Beautiful big island. And Horn Island was right in front of Thursday Island, out like from the jetty. Thursday Island varied between about 93 and 73. And you had your southeast wind for 8 months. Then she turned round on the northwest, and you might get 40 inches of rain in a couple of months, or 60 inches rain in a couple of months from the northwest season. And then she come down. She came down in sheets. And mould formed on your boots, and if you put a shirt on, you couldn't get it off. It was perspiration. It was all wet. And it wasn't too good then, but as far as I was concerned, I just didn't care about the climate at all. I went out fishing and swimming and after crayfish and had picnics and so on. I was a busy little boy then too, because I was secretary of the Dance Association. We had a dance there every fortnight. And, of course, another thing was too, we only did a 6-hour day. Now, you take it midnight to 6. You had a bit of a sleep and you had the rest of the day to yourself. You got 18 hours a day to yourself. Well, what's 6 hours out of a day? You could please yourself what you did. Of course, you didn't have a friend to go out with, only on the weekends, and I used to work at to have the weekend off.
Ellis Smellie was to spend long hours into the night polishing up his Morse code skill. He had to adjust to a new sound.
When I went from the railways to the radio, I had to change over from the clicking of the sounder to the sort of whistle, or buzzer as we called it, of the radio side. Now, I thought I'd made that change 100%. I was just as good on the buzzer as I had been on the sounder, which, of course, as I told you, was pretty good. But a chap named Charlie Tapp came up. Now, he was a remarkable fellow, this Charlie Tapp, but he had gone only through the Marconi School of Wireless. He knew nothing of the sounder, and he had perfected his receiving to the extent where he beat me at it, although he was only about a 20-word-a-minute man, because, like the conductor of a band, he was able to follow a weak signal right through stronger signals and hang on to it and take a message that I couldn't take. I was on duty when Port Moresby opened up, and they sent me a message which I could not take. There was a terrific amount of atmospherics, and ships were working and things were happening, and I couldn't get the message. After about half an hour, I had bits and pieces all over the place, and Charlie Tapp came in and he took that message without the slightest trouble on one sending. Oh, it bit into me. But 2 years later, I was just as good as Charlie Tapp. I absolutely worked at it until I was able to do that. Now, in order to have someone to listen to, I used to listen to a station called Yap in the Caroline Islands. Of course, Germany owned it then. And the Gneisenau, Scharnhorst, the Emden, the Gear, and the Comet, all German battleships. And I used to listen to their there working, and I got to know the fist of every operator aboard every one of those ships.
Even though the Morse key is a simple on and off switch, every operator has a distinctive rhythm, a kind of Morse code fingerprint, which telegraphists call their fist.
Now, when the war broke out, I was able to telegraph to the Navy office in Melbourne the secret call signs, which was 2 letters, of every ship, because I knew the fist of the man. As soon as he put his hand on the key, I knew what ship he was on. So I fed that into Melbourne, and later on I got onto this station at Yap, big telephone station, and they sent what we called a dotty code, and it sounded about 60 words a minute, and you didn't know what it was. And on one occasion, about 4 in the morning, I went to sleep, and as I woke up, I read that code. But I could never do it again. Now, when the war broke out, it was absolutely essential for me to read that code. So I sat on it. I tried to put myself into a trance. I tried to put myself into the same sort of half asleep, half awake when I had read it before, and I succeeded. I read that dotty code. Now, what it consisted of was an extra dot before every dot and an extra dot before every dash. Now, A is dot dash, the dotty code, dot dot, dot dash. Now, C is dash dot dash dot. So on the dotty code it came out dot dash, dot dot, dot dash, dot dot. The rhythm was there, and I could read that rhythm. As a matter of fact, I read the darn thing for about a week before I worked out what it was. And Yap used to come on at sunset, and I took all the interceptions and stay there 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning when Yap closed down. Sometimes I'd be there right to daylight.
Ellis Smelly told me he had a major row with Charlie Tapp, the Morse expert, because he wouldn't let the Navy in Melbourne know the simple secret of this dotty code. They could have read it there, but Tapp wanted all the credit. However, Ellis was able to get other information to Melbourne. He quickly learnt about the effects local conditions had on the sounds of radio signals. As well as his knowledge of the individual operator's fists, Smelly was able to use his experience of radio signals to make very educated estimates about the positions of enemy ships, a primitive form of radar.
Yes, I alerted the Navy office of Melbourne that the Emden was leaving the area. And the signals at midnight, there was a long variation of about 2 seconds and a very fast variation of, say, 4 or 5 times a second. The first time I said that was because it was over the high mountains and the Emden was close inshore. At 3 in the morning, the long variations had almost gone. The quick variations had varied in such a way that I recognised where it was because other ships had that same variation in the same position. And at daylight, I was almost certain of the fact that that Emden was right at the entrance to a strait between 2 islands, because that strait was used by the merchant ships, and I knew that that variation took place when those merchant ships were there. So I told them where the Emden was at daylight. Now, many long years afterwards, Fred Newman at Melbourne, he'd been handling all the stuff I'd been sending down and handling it with the Navy. He told me that the British cruiser that was sent to intercept the Emden on the information that I had supplied missed the Emden by about 20 miles. Now, my name doesn't appear anywhere on any of that, so it can't be checked on or anything, but that is what happened. And one of the things I'm very, very proud of is that I was mixed up with that sort of thing.
Station calling Sydney Radio, Channel 16. Please repeat, over.
Sydney Radio, it's Radio Tex on board Adventurer. Doing a radio maintenance check on number 2 transceiver, over.
Adventurer, this is Sydney Radio. I'm receiving you loud and clear, over.
Much obliged for that, Sydney Radio. Radio Tex out.
Sydney Radio out.
Tell me, with the operating at on the coastal radio, did you, over the years, you said you recognised the fists of different ships operators.
Yeah.
Did you build up a relationship with the operators in the different ships?
Very much so. Very much so, yes. You knew them. And in Perth there, quite often they came up and visited, and we went down and visited them down there. But you could almost tell their personalities by the way they sent messages and their Morse code. You could tell their nationalities. Germans were slow, very correct, and no nonsense about them at all. Swedes were very much like the Germans, and Norway was just a little bit faster, a little bit more enthusiasm into it. French and Italian, they went like the blazers. They broke down a lot. They were sent all funny dots and things all over the place, and you have to be very careful getting them. The Americans varied. You couldn't tell an American. Some were fast, and some were slow, and they didn't seem to have a nationality. The Egyptians, they had a style all their own. A very peculiar style, the Egyptians.
Ella Smelly's work on Thursday Island involved telegraphing messages to and from ships at sea, and of course looking out for distress calls.
When I first went up there were 3 operators on most of the ships. After the Titanic went down, there was a big conference, and it was decided to put 3 operators on all ships, not for the benefit of the ship that they were on, but for the benefit of the big passenger liner that might be in trouble right alongside. And ships over 750 tons had to have 3 operators aboard. And wasn't there an outcry from the shipping companies themselves when they had to provide the cabins and all that sort of thing for 3 operators?
When Fred Canning started work on the coal ship Kunda in 1921, he was the sole operator.
She was the smallest ship then fitted with radio, barely over 1,000 tons, and she only just came over the limit, which by that time had become compulsory to have radio fitted, or else you would never have had it. But I went to sea on her and spent the next nearly 3 years, I suppose, until 1924 on the Kunda. One operator only, just by oneself.
No assistant?
Oh, no, nothing at all. No, one kept fixed watch periods. A watch period at the morning, another one in the afternoon, and then the main watch at night from 8 to midnight. No, it was rather difficult in those days, because if you really got into distress, you couldn't really put out a distress call until somebody came on watch. And if it was outside the regular watchkeeping hours, you could call your head off and nobody came. I was lucky enough to pick up one like that, but only just in time. I came on watch one morning at 8 o'clock, and the very first thing I picked up was SOS. One of BHP's iron carriers, called the Iron Prince, had gone ashore just off Gabo Island, a most treacherous place where if you miscalculate your navigation you can go aground at the greatest of ease. Well, I picked up this thing. We were rather far away. We were getting up towards Sydney by that time, but we turned round and went back hell for leather. But there was another ship, also rather closer, and we turned it over to her. It was a question of getting there quickly. In the meantime, the crew had managed to scramble ashore and were housed in the lighthouse. They were lucky that they were able to get ashore. The tide was a bit low, or had become low by the time they had to get ashore, and they were able to scramble over the rocks and get in. But that is the kind of thing, the conditions under which operations took place in those days.
A, E, R, I, A, L, Ariel?
From dawn till dark we study code. A harder row I've never hoed. We've got to study to get by, and holy smoke, but it is dry. To copy mile-long strings of talk would make old Job get up and balk. Good night, and still long months of it, I often think I'd better quit. But when the harbour whistles blow, I think of places I could know. Had I the right to pitch my camp aboard some ocean-going tramp? Oh, gee, to see before I die the Cuban palms against the sky, Waikiki's beach, the maelstrom's coil were worth a century of toil. And so to gain the open road, I sit me down and study code.
H. Earth. E. T. H. E. R. Ether.
I didn't have much idea of what would happen, but the idea of going away to sea as a wireless officer appealed to me, because I thought, well, I'll never be able to see the world, stuck in an office all my life, but if I go away as a wireless officer, I'll travel all around the world.
In 1914, Arnold Lawrence was a schoolboy in Christchurch, New Zealand, tinkering about with wireless sets in his backyard. One of his more unforgettable trips as a wireless operator was with an oil tanker, the Harve, on its way to Singapore. When he turned up, the captain reckoned they didn't need a wireless operator, and the set didn't seem to get further than 50 miles anyway. But Arnold made sure that the radio was given a thorough overhaul, and just as well, for they ran into a cyclonic storm.
We got further and further. We slowly got out into the Tasman Sea. We passed Cape Farewell, and we were still plugging into this cyclone, punching into it, terrific waves crashing over the bow and keeping us at a standstill almost. So we gradually burnt up all the coal. We got about a third of the way across to Sydney, and the howling gale was still blowing at us. So they started to burn all the woodwork of the ship, the lining of the bunkers and different things to keep us going. But it wasn't sufficient, and we finally ended up with no coal, no lining of the bunkers. The only thing we had left were the derricks.
The problem for Arnold Lawrence was that the Harve didn't have any emergency power for the radio. It normally ran off the ship's main engine. But now the only way to supply power to the transmitter was by putting fuel into the smaller donkey engine to generate electricity.
So what we had to do, every time we wanted to send any messages out, we had to saw up a derrick. So they got the seamen to do that. They'd saw off a derrick about 4 or 5 feet long, and then split it up with axes and put it in the donkey engine, and then we'd send the messages. As we burnt a derrick, as we cut off a part of the derrick and burnt it, well, I'd come on the air and I'd send out our position, and I'd say, we are on limited supplies of fuel, and I will be sending out this message and repeating it until the fuel supply runs out. When you receive the position, would all stations that received it kindly reply back, but not to expect an answer until the next time I send out the position?
Arnold Lawrence received messages from all the nearby coastal radio stations that his position had been picked up and that a tug would arrive in 2 to 3 days. So his main task was to keep transmitting the ship's position for the tug in a heavy sea by lantern light. He doesn't remember sleeping much during that period, breaking off only for a meal, and that was his first voyage as the sole radio officer.
Hello, ZLW, Zulu Lima Whiskey, Wellington Radio. This is the Tarico, call sign Zulu Mike Lima Papa, with one weather. You copy Wellington, over. Tarico, this is Auckland Radio. We've got traffic for you when you finish with Wellington, over.
Because of their work in those earliest days, ship's wireless operators like Arnold Lawrence and Fred Canning were a key link in the spread of new radio knowledge, techniques and even components. By Fred Canning's time in the early 1920s, AWA had started replacing the crystal receivers with valve sets built around its own Expanse B valve made in Australia.
My particular transmitter was a really peculiar job. It was a collection of bits and pieces that had been scrounged from all directions. Good enough for this little ship, which they wouldn't have fitted a radio at all if they hadn't been made to. And they scrounged every kind of imaginable obsolete gear to make it up. None of it was official AWA transmitter practice in those days, but it worked.
Was it a bit of a tradition with the ship's operators to go, I suppose, without the knowledge or approval of their employers, to modify their receivers, say, to improve the performance?
I went further and built my own receiver and took it to sea with me. One day I found myself in Newcastle alongside a Japanese ship at the Coal Wharf, and it was a practice among operators in those days to visit each other's ships whenever they got a chance and look at each other's gear and generally chew the rag. And the Japanese chap also had a version of this same kind of valve. They'd followed in exactly the same tracks and had made a soft tubular valve, a long thing, looking not unlike our Expanse B. And I did the unforgivable thing and swapped a valve with him. AWA would have sacked me on the spot if they'd known, but I don't know how I concealed it, but I did. I had a spare valve. We always had to go to see spare valves because they were very unreliable. What used to happen was that under the vibration of the ships, the filaments used to come apart. And each valve had two filaments to guard against that, and you had to switch on the receiver to switch from one filament to the next so that you weren't interrupted on watch if one did fail, and they often did. And then next time you came to port, you put in indented for another valve, and you got one valve, was all you were allowed, one spare valve to keep going. They were quite difficult to make, actually, and they didn't all work. They were very, very erratic and variable things. So I think I took the bull by the horns and swapped my spare valve to the Japanese chap for one of his spare valves. And later on, I built my own receiver out of scrap and put the Japanese valve in. And for most of the time after that, I was actually using that receiver, although I kept it very carefully concealed. I didn't use the AWA receiver at all. But I managed to get better results out of that than I could get from the official receiver, so I kept on using it.
Fred Canning and Arnold Lawrence both left Maritime Wireless to work in new sections of the radio industry. Canning helped start up the Police Wireless in Melbourne, and Lawrence joined 3LO. Ellis Smelly worked with the Coastal Radio Service for 41 years, and then worked for another 11 years as a ship's operator. The ABC Social History Unit presents Roll Your Own Radio, the third program in the series Bright Sparks, Australian Radio Stories, compiled by Stephen Rapley.
The ABC presents The Hams, being a tribute to the amateur enthusiasts whose experimental and developmental work in radio has played such a notable part in communication and broadcasting. The Hams. This is their proud story.
Calling CQDX, 20-meter phone. This is 3KU, calling CQDX. CQDX, 20-meter phone. CQDX, calling CQDX, coming please. CQDX, 20-meter phone.
That's how the ABC began a dramatised feature about amateur radio, broadcast in 1946, shortly after the Hams had managed to get back onto the air after the Second World War. It's thanks to an enterprising radio amateur with a disc-cutting machine that we have a copy of the original program. It was a time when people were first hearing of the wartime duty played by radio and its offspring like radar, and of the thousands of service radio operators, many of whom were Hams before the war. The ABC drama traced the tradition back to the man it called the first amateur, Marconi.
First, a bell was made to ring. An unseen pulse of energy leapt across the young Marconi's workroom and made a bell ring. A bell. Not a peal of victory bells that might more fittingly have marked such a triumph. Not the deep, exulting note of a bell cast in bronze, but a cheap, clattering, clamorous electric bell that stuttered, stopped, and started again. The first tremulous cry of the wonder child of that inspired mind. Wireless was born. 1895, a few feet. 1896, a few yards. 1897, a few miles.
people could understand the telephone because there was a wire connected. They could understand that by some means a sound would come along the wire. They could understand the telegraph with the dots and the dashes because the signals were running over a wire. But wireless, there was no interconnecting medium. It was absolute magic that somebody could, with turning a little knob, could pick out a voice out of the air from London or anywhere that you could identify. You could hear music in the air. It was absolutely magic, and I think that's really what got people on. And things like sporting things there, where people had no hope of going to see a test match, particularly when they were in London there. But by the flick of a switch and turning of a knob, they could hear that Bradman had made another century.
Jack Ross has written about the history of radio in Australia. He grew up in Toowoomba in the 1920s and 30s.
Time, you had plenty of it, of course, but it took a long time to do anything, to go anywhere, and certainly if you wanted to talk to anybody about wireless problems or anything like that, it was quite an exercise. Nearly all farmers, of course, anybody who had a battery lighting set or anything, they all considered themselves as first-class electrical engineers, and therefore they had a God-given right to be an expert on radio. And of course, the news still got around. It soon got around that certain man was good at radio, and don't go near this other fella there; he'll blow your valves or something like that. There. So, as I said, there were so many. It was so far away where we lived there that it wasn't possible to become close to anybody or spend so much time with them. So it was a question like people out in the country that you're on your own. You got most of your information out of your threepenny magazines and things like that there if you wanted to learn about radio.
Which magazine do you remember reading as a boy?
Oh, well, there was things called Broadcast News, Broadcast Engineering, and, of course, in South Australia, which I also had copies at that time, even though it wasn't in South Australia, the South Australian Wireless Weekly, that was cheap because that was only threepence. And you could find that on the bookstores in Brisbane and that. But nearly every state, certainly capital city, produced magazines. And then there was magazines that came in from England, and, of course, the overseas magazines, like Radio Craft and all those sort of things that came from United States and English magazines. There was no shortage of magazines on wireless, just the same as there was no shortage of magazines on all sorts of hobbies.
They called themselves the Hams. In suburban backyards, tall masts rose waveringly into the skies. Wires were spread to catch fragmentary whispers of Morse.
This is VK3MP of the present days, but way back in 1908, I can remember when all we could use was the brass staircase rods for the transmitter with spark coils for exciting, and for the receiver we also used brass staircase rods and coherer.
Stan Hoskin, reminiscing on the amateur bands in 1950 about the earliest experimental days in Australia.
About 1909, the crystal came to hand, and later following that was the expedition to the South Pole using Macquarie Island as a base. We were able to receive that at Surrey Hills at a house of A.J. Stocks, who's passed away now. His father was kind enough to build an 80-foot mast for us, and we did all our work there. We used three-slide tuners and loose couplers and all the rest that we could think of at the time.
Because Australia was so far from the sources of radio components, for quite a long time, amateur experimenters had to make do and roll their own radios.
In a lot of cases, you had to make your parts because you couldn't buy them. Early on, back in the 20s and early 30s, we did make a lot of parts. It was very necessary at times to make your own capacitors or condensers, as we called them in those days. And you always had your workbench somewhere and a scrap box, a junk box as the Yanks call it. And it was a case of makeshift, and you made whatever you required. If you couldn't buy it, well, you had to make it, and you just did so.
My first crystal that I made myself was on a bit of insulating material that my father brought home from work to make it for the job. I think it consisted of rotary switches, all handmade, and the knobs on the thing were screw tops off bottles of hair oil, filled up with sealing wax, and sunk onto the shaft with sealing wax. I remember making all them up, and the contacts on the board were paper clips, the little brass foil paper clips they use here, the pointed things. They were all soldered. You drilled a hole, took them in, bent them over at the back and soldered the wires on them. They were all the taps on the coils. But it's quite a while ago now. It's getting a bit vague.
And then bits and pieces were made up. I used Meccano set to make brackets on the top of this box to improve things, and somehow or other found a piece of square brass somewhere and wangled something to make a slider, and I had a coil with a slider on it. I even used sacks of salt cardboard containers to wind coils on. Again, economy dictated most of these things.
Frank Taylor, Jack Sullivan and Jack Seabrook. One of the most complicated components to make was the condenser, especially the variable condenser for tuning. Bob Pine and Otto Sandel.
The foil that used to come off chocolates, well, you could cut that into little squares and put the tissue paper in between, dip the tissue paper in candle wax and then put that in between and make yourself a capacitor. Another way of making a variable capacitor was two tins like jam tins, one a little bit smaller than the other, and you'd cut them in half lengthwise and rig up a skewer through one of them so you could turn it so that it turned inside the other one. Or you could get two tins of different size and just push one into the other as long as they didn't touch. And that would vary the capacity between them. That was, one way around not having the 4 and 6 or whatever it was to buy a capacitor.
You could buy the valves, you made everything else. If it was a tuning condenser, you made it. I made the tuning condensers out of some test tubes that I got from Elliott Brothers. You buy large test tubes, you cut a piece of zinc, bend it round to fit inside, and you built it. You cut another one and made that round to go on the outside. And you soldered a wire onto each one, and the one on the outside, you made that the earth one, and you slid that up and down to tune the receiver in or the transmitter in. That's how you made your tuning condenser to tune the thing to the wavelengths that you wanted. Even the ones for the receiver. You tuned in with a test tube.
The Hams could make radios out of almost anything. Max Lovelace was an operator with the Australian forces fighting in Timor in 1942. With all their radio gear destroyed, Lovelace and a team of signalmen were gradually able to put together a complete transmitting station out of parts raided from behind enemy lines. The radio, known as Winnie the War Winner, built on kerosene tins, is in the Australian War Memorial.
Complete outfits from £5. Honeycomb coils from 6 shillings and sixpence.
Electrolytic condenser. Electromagnetic
knobs,
wave.
dials, rheostats, switch arms, ebonite and bakelite panels, cabinets, etc.
Energy.
Switch points,
Ether. Fading.
Thermionic valve. All crystals 6 and 1
Super
shilling.
heterodyne. Filament. Flux. Frequency.
Switch arms are a decent
Grid
job.
wires.
4 and 6.
Microphone. Grid link.
Sliders for turning coils, 1 and 9 pence. Terminals, 6 pence.
Hand capacity.
Get your name down.
Harmonics.
Price, 6
Heavy
pence.
side layer.
Absolute satisfaction guaranteed.
I was interested in radio as a small boy when the only station you could receive here was the spark transmitter in the domain, VIM. And you'd get that at 9 o'clock at night. It would give a time signal. And it'd transmit some shipping information and weather information.
The earliest experimenters tuned into the signals of the coastal radio stations to see how their new receivers worked. Ivor Morgan's first set was as basic as they come.
This was a thing that I could make, safety razor blades mounted in a piece of wood, and you gently rest a piece of carbon out of a pencil on the, and of course the bad contact creates the rectification, and it was more unstable than a cat's whisker, but just the same, I could receive VIM on that, and a lot of aerial, a pair of headphones, and all this kind of thing. And it was built on a board that was set up in my mother's laundry, and I had to take it down when she wanted to do the washing because it occupied so much space.
Hello, hello, hello. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Speech. The first uncertain word was spoken early in the century. But articulation came slowly until the development of the thermionic tube, the valve, swept the last obstacles aside, and the muffled voice broke clearly through.
Hello, hello. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
And out of this bedlam, broadcasting was born.
We must have been, I suppose, 12 miles or something out of Brisbane, and if I'd saved up sixpence for pocket money, the first thing was I'd go in town and see what I can find. Well, you'd ride your bike or get a lift in there by somebody you knew that was going in there, and you'd spend most of your day with your nose pressed against the glass window there, you know, drooling over if I could only get another threepence, I could get that. If I'd only had another penny, I could get this, you know. In the end, you'd probably finish up coming away with 6 feet of copper wire or something for another coil, or a burnt-out resistance or something like that there that had to be patched up, or a condenser that had all the plates all broken, and you had to patch that up. Well, that's just about all you could get. But to get anything new, like a brand new tuning condenser, you're talking about 17 and sixpence. Well, like that wasn't on, you know, somebody who got tuppence a week pocket money or something like that there. But fortunately, if you showed any interest, a lot of the elderly people who had an interest in wireless, they'd always have some parts in their old box for you if they knew that you were very keen and interested. So you just seem to get these things without having much money. And I think in the radio clubs, nearly every suburb had its radio club, and boys wouldn't miss that for the world. I know there was a radio club not far from us, and rain, hail or snow, we'd go there. Probably didn't understand a word they were talking about, but you just had to be there. It was part of the camaraderie to be amongst those who knew about wireless, hoping that some of it would brush off onto you.
We used to call Homecraft, used to call McElroy was the man's name, and he used to import out a lot of radio stuff from America and England. But did he know how to charge? He certainly did. But eventually, most of us used to go into that shop and have a look at a piece of apparatus, have a good look at it, and we'd make one from it.
Did people sit there and kind of count the number of turns on the coil and work out how the diameter of the coil so they could reproduce it at home?
Well, if you were quick enough, you'd pick up the piece of apparatus and just go like that with your pencil on the top of it, and that gives you an idea how many turns. But sometimes old McElroy was a little bit of a wake up to that, and he stopped that sort of arrangement. But then later on, the little books came out to tell you how to make a tuning for apparatus. We didn't worry about McElroy. Didn't worry about him at all. The only thing we did worry about is perhaps used to buy the wire from him and the slider arrangement and what they call a loose coupler, 2 coils that go inside one another. But he was a wake up, but I used to charge, and his spark business used to charge a lot of money for that. My first spark coil transmitter was from a Ford coil. I used to use a Ford coil for spark transmission. Of course, that was knocked on the head in the latter years for it caused too much interference to broadcast listeners, and they used to complain.
Bill Seavers had a go at making the most complex component of the lot.
I made my own valve in the years gone by, but I was never successful. It didn't last very, very long because I couldn't evacuate the tube enough. All I had to do was using a bicycle pump. Well, that wasn't sufficient. And by the time I got what I thought all the air was out of the tube, and I sealed the end of it at last, it lasted for a while, but it didn't last too long because the filament gave away. It worked from a 12-volt, 6-volt or 12-volt, mainly a 6-volt battery in those days.
What did you use to make the valve with?
I used fuse wire. So you can just imagine that wouldn't last very long depending upon what amperage that battery was giving out.
How were you going to seal up the vacuum once you'd pumped it?
Well, it's glass blowing arrangement. I started to learn that, as a matter of fact. One or two friends came over to help me over in Richmond, over here, but we weren't successful, just for saying.
For many years, amateurs enjoyed relative freedom on the bands. But after broadcasting began, they were limited to the shorter wavelengths that engineers considered useless. However, as an international group, they quickly discovered that these short waves could cover longer distances.
About 1922, my station made a low-power record that has not since been beaten, as far as I am aware. Using a power of less than that used by a torchlight, I was able to communicate with New Zealand, a distance of 1,200 miles.
Charles McClurkin was interviewed in 1944 by the ABC's Leslie Rees.
Wireless Weekly, at that time, consistently referred to you as our leading experimenter. What other experiments were you conducting about then? Well, quite apart from broadcasting, I was interested in the shortwave transmissions on low power, and the general trend of experiments was directed in particular to operating on shorter and shorter wavelengths. To help prove my theories, I made an experimental trip to America in 1924, accompanied by a schoolboy experimenter named Jack Davis, who is now one of the engineers in Amalgamated Wireless. This trip was made on the RMS Tahiti, and the object was to see how far communications could be maintained using short wavelengths and very low power. A specially built shortwave transmitter and receiver was installed on the afterboat deck of the ship, and the aerial was suspended from the mainmast. The wireless cabin was lifted bodily onto the deck and there lashed in position. The result of this trip was most amazing, and communication was established from my station in Strathfield across the Pacific to San Francisco. In the years following, up to 1927, my station was able to establish direct contact with South Africa and England on a 20-meter wavelength. On the occasion of the English contact, I sent a message to His Majesty King George V from the experimenters of Australia, and in due course received His Majesty's thanks. Getting these results often entailed rising at 3 a.m. for months on end. In 1927, I finally gave up my radio activities, as I had found the world a very small place indeed, having then been in direct communication with all the 5 continents. So I called it a day. Anyhow, Mrs. McClurkin said she had been a wireless widow long enough.
Behind the front line of record-breaking experimenters, there were many amateurs listening in and reporting on the quality of new signals. Frank Taylor grew up in Subiaco in Perth during the 30s. He remembers learning Morse code from a local amateur, Ian Dick.
Initially, we used to work by lights, lamp signalling. He was able to borrow from time to time a Lucas signalling lamp from his army unit, and he'd set that up in his bedroom on the second story of the place and point that across the backyards, and I would sit in our kitchen, and I had a torch, a bullseye type torch, which had a lamp on the side of it, and I had a flat 6 or 9 volt battery, and I used to practice Morse code with him on virtually lamp signalling. Then we really improved because somehow or other I made a buzzer. So we put wires across the backyard from along the fence and to his place, and we used to communicate with the buzzer. And that, of course, gave me a more effective use of Morse code. And in fact, I recall going out with him in his sidecar on his motorbike on more than one occasion, he in his uniform and me wrapped up in something warm, going to one or two of the night signals exercises that he went on. It was fairly informal, being a reserve situation. I can remember going up to Kings Park with him on more than one occasion whilst they were using the Lucas signalling lamps from Kings Park to South Perth or somewhere on the other side of the river, and really enjoying that. They'd have the Lucas signalling lamp on a tripod and the battery box and the Morse key and so on, and was I thrilled to see that Morse key, which was a real manufactured one and not something that I'd cooked up myself. Never had one, though, until after the war when I bought one disposals.
So you kept your little Meccano key?
Oh, yes, it was just cooked up on a piece of jarrah that I'd scrounged from somewhere, part of a fruit box, actually.
My first recollection of being involved in broadcasting as such was 1932, when I was just a schoolboy, about 10 or 11. It was when the English cricketers under Jardine came out here, and of course most people can remember the furore that those cricketers caused at that time, and of course being a cricket fanatic myself, even at that tender age, all I wanted to do was to listen to every ball-by-ball description of those historic battles. And we lived out in the bush from Brisbane with no amenities whatsoever, no electricity or anything like that. There was a man about a mile or so away from us who had a magnificent 6-valve battery receiver that lit up like a searchlight when he had it on. And I thought this was great, and he knew I liked this cricket. He liked the cricket too, even though he's a farmer. We'd come in when I came home from school and listen to the end of the broadcast, and he encouraged me to become interested in the technical side of it, and he showed me how to build a crystal set using a Bourneville cocoa tin for the coil, and with a few scrap parts that he had around the place, and an old single telephone, or for candlestick telephone receiver. We built a set which I took home, erected an enormous aerial in the back house from the top of a tree onto the chimney of the house, and I was on my own from there. I read everything I could read on radio. I'd spend my threepences on magazines that were around at the time there, and by about 1934, 2 years later, when the Australians were going to England, I considered myself a bit of an expert in radio by then. I'd constructed and dismantled quite a number of crystal sets, and I'd also got to the stage where I'd built some battery sets. So I was preparing myself to listen to these English people, the broadcast direct from England, to listen to all my favourites, the teams. I can still remember many of the names fairly well. I remember there was a stack of people called Bill. There was a Bill Woodfull, of course, the captain, Bill Ponsford, Bill Brown, and Bill Oldfield, the wicket-keeper. They were like gods to a young fellow like me. Well, I thought that I'd get onto this English broadcast fairly easily, but of course it wasn't too. I didn't know much about the technicalities. Of course, when I come to pick up Shortwave and the BBC, it wasn't on with the crystal set or the sets that I had, so I talked to poor old Dad into buying what they call then an all-wave set. They'd just come out in 1934 that allowed the ordinary receivers in the home to pick up shortwave broadcasts as well as the standard local medium frequency stations, including 4QG, which is the main one we listen to. Anyhow, Dad raked up the money somewhere, Lord knows where from. We didn't have any money, and we got this magnificent console all-wave receiver. I think it cost £8 or £9, which was an enormous amount of money there, and from then on it was on all the time till 3 o'clock in the morning, I think it was, and I'd listen to these broadcasts every time they were on there, and even though I was up all night till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I'd have an hour's sleep and cut the wood and do what I had to do before I went to work, and I'd be off as happy as a lark, none the worse for not having slept much during the night.
When the ABC feature The Hams was broadcast, it included one of the earliest sounds from outer space. Amateur ingenuity had literally leapt out of this world. On the evening of the 10th of January 1946, 3 American hams bounced a radio signal off the face of the moon.
2.5 seconds after the signal leaves, you should hear a beep from it. 1 every 4 seconds.
Yeah, but I don't want to be difficult, Chief, but how we know they're from the moon?
Because it's the only object 40,000 miles from the Earth. The time lag will prove it. Now, if the beeps come back quicker or later than 2.5 seconds, well, it's not the moon we've hit. But if they come back dead on that time, then they're back from the moon. Okay?
Okay.
Ready, sir. Well, let's get going then. Now, watch the screen.
There she goes. On your way, buddy.
1, 2, there, did you see it?
No, I guess not.
There's the next one going. Wait, I'll bring up the game.
Wow! Oh, boy! Listen to the moon talking.
$1895. 1902. 1946. $240,000 miles. Not bad for the ham.
Full length, full wavelength.
In Roll Your Own Radio, you heard Jack Ross, Stan Hoskin, Frank Taylor, Jack Sullivan and Jack Seabrook, Bob Pine, Otto Sandell, Ivor Morgan and Bill Sievers. Our thanks to Mrs. Ilse Morgan and Chris Long for archival material used in this program. The interview with Charles McClurkin is from the ABC's radio archives, and the program included excerpts from the cassette The Sounds of Amateur Radio, produced by the Wireless Institute of Australia. In the next program, Loudspeakers, we'll hear more about the amateurs and their early broadcasts. Music for the series was written and performed by Kathy Peters, production of Bright Spark Sharon Davis, Judy Lowry and Stephen Rapley for the ABC's Social History Unit.
The fact was, if you heard music or a noise, somebody speaking, that was magic up there. Distortion was not in the picture. But today, of course, everybody talks about distortion. That's all they want to talk about. If you hear a little scratch, the distortion. If you got a tape recorder, they say, how much is the wow and flutter? Who ever heard of such rubbish years ago there? And this just goes on. And I wonder today whether, in fact, we still get the same enjoyment. I know if I listen to the test from England today via satellite, sometimes I wonder whether I get the same enjoyment out of listening to it as I did 50 years ago when I had my ear glued to the earpiece with static and noise and crackle and all sorts of things going on there. I doubt it.
You're coming in here all right if you're getting this. Will you come back, or any other interstate ham, Tasmania or any other state?
The ABC Social History Unit presents Loudspeakers, the fourth program in the series Bright Sparks, Australian Radio Stories, compiled by Stephen Rapley.
The first time I put TEW on the air was at Manly on Boxing Day 1922. I just turned the transmitter on and I played records for a couple of hours. Eventually I gave the phone number out and I received a call from Pennant Hills. It was a Saturday afternoon, if I remember rightly, and Pennant Hills rang me and said, get off the air, you're right on the 600-metre band, and we haven't been able to receive a call from any ship for the 2 hours you've been transmitting.
Amateurs were the first on the air transmitting regular musical concerts before official broadcasting got underway in late 1923. Otto Sandell started broadcasting 2UW as a 19-year-old from a bedroom in his aunt's boarding house at Manly.
Hello, hello. The time is 20 minutes past 10. This is a experimental station, VK3DH. Aha, that's the atmosphere. Now, incidentally, here's a little music. It's Love Again by Louis Levy, the Gaumont British Symphony. Here we go.
The amateurs broadcast all over Australia. In Melbourne, Ivor Morgan's station, 3DH, was fitted out with a small disc-cutting machine. He used it to record pieces of this other side of broadcasting, which was to disappear from the band when the Second World War began.
3OV Camberwell. Jack Payne's band will play the rhythm-style foxtrot, Lazy Rhythm.
One of the earliest voices of Australian radio was experimenter Charles McClurkin, who was regularly heard on Sunday evenings. In 1944, he recalled those first broadcasts with the ABC's Leslie Rees.
What exactly caused you to start broadcasting? I mean, with the human voice. I had been carrying out experiments with the voice in conjunction with Mr. Basil Cook of the Sydney Observatory. So many letters from listeners were received requesting further transmissions that I decided in 1921 to give regular transmissions every Sunday night. Which you did? Yes. For some months, my station was the only one on the air, giving musical entertainment. Well, what was a typical 7:30 p.m. Sunday concert? A typical concert would consist of possibly 8 or 9 of the latest gramophone record releases, interspersed with Morse code practice, a few facetious gags and recitations, and then some lectures on radio matters, which were mostly, of course, instructions to listeners on how to make their receivers. You must remember that in those early days, everyone had to make their own receiving apparatus, and I was constantly being asked to supply circuit diagrams and other details for building receiving sets. Well, did you get much response? How many listeners had you, do you think? The results were really amazing, and the number of letters I used to receive necessitated having an assistant to answer them. On one special occasion, when I wanted to check up on the number of listeners, I asked my audience to write and let me know how many people were listening. Over 3,000 admitted listening in. When I say admitted, you'll realize that even then there were some who wouldn't pay for a license, and naturally they wouldn't like to admit they were listening, so that the audience must have been considerably greater than this number. And what was this special occasion you refer to? It was in March 1923, when Miss Josie Melville broadcast from my station. She was then playing the title role in the musical comedy Sally. I think this really was the first time in Australia that a professional artist had gone on the air. Miss Melville visited my home at Strathfield. The transmitting apparatus was housed in the back garden, and to my astonishment, Josie was so overcome by the sight of all the weird contraptions that on opening her mouth to sing, not a sound came forth. However, she overcame her fright and sang 2 songs from Sally, Look for the Silver Lining and You Can't Keep a Good Girl Down. When interviewed by the press next day, Josie said, It is beyond me. The mysteriousness is too great. The thought that so many listeners, whom I could not see, quite overawed me.
Miss Melville said that before she started singing into the microphone, she felt more nervous than she had ever done on the stage. It is beyond me, she said. The mysteriousness is too great. I do not know why I was so nervous, but the thought that so many people who I could not see were listening to me quite overawed me.
Well, you also mentioned giving recitations. I'll bet you can't remember any of them at this distance. Oh, yes. Many of them had to be repeated so often by request that I'm sure I'll be reciting them in the next world. Tongue twisters were always popular, and the one describing the death of my brother John had not only to be repeated often, but written out and forwarded to my listeners.
Well, what was that?
Well, you must know that my brother John was courting a girl named Suey. He took Suey to the seaside to sue for Suey's hand. He sat by her side, she sat by his side, he sighed, she sighed, and the wind sighed, and there they sat sighing side by side. She sighed for cider. He left the place he had beside her to get the cider, but she no sooner got the cider inside her than she lay down and died her. And he drank some cider, and he died, and the verdict was he died by suicide.
Good. Well?
Then there was the one about the sleeping car, and it went something like this. Now, a sleeping car is known as a sleeper, and sleepers for sleepers they keep. And sleepers run under the sleepers in which the sleepers in those sleepers sleep. Now, if a slop sleeps in a sleeper, and the sleeper beneath it goes pop, it's a logical cert that the slop will get hurt, because no sleeper sleeps like a slop. Of course, you have to have your teeth in to say these.
I'll say you have.
Like Otto Sandel's 2UW, many of the present-day commercial broadcasters began as amateur stations. Amateurs built and ran the transmitters, and the studio was invariably part of the house. Walter Exton's father George built 2XN, the first commercial station in Lismore, New South Wales, in 1930.
We had to think of things to do. It was a period of trial and error, and for instance, we all tried to do something to entertain. That was terrible sometimes. Anyhow, my father, for instance, he I think you have something here, that he
He used to put a roll on the piano, or I think in this particular instance, Love's Old Sweet Song, and he would sing. He would pedal this thing and sing Love's Old Sweet Song, and I got the recording of him on a little disc recorder that I had.
Father was a paddock bookmaker, but he used to bet at Randwick as well as in Brisbane, and he decided that Sydney was the best place for him, and he gave away Brisbane and came to live in Sydney. We had a house at Kensington for 6 months, and then we moved up to Victoria Road, Bellevue Hill, opposite Birriga Road, and being about the highest point at Bellevue Hill, it was an ideal spot for me for the radio transmitter, and I put up a couple of 80-foot masts, one on the front of the house and one at the rear of the house, and aerials strung between them, and I used my bedroom for the radio transmitter and receivers and that. And due to its position, probably, we used to get a lot of letters for what was known as the Dutch East Indies at that stage, receiving my signals over there. I used to play records, mostly Edison Diamond disc records. I used to play those. The quality of those was far superior to the ordinary lateral cut records that were on sale in those days. Every Sunday we had a live show. We held at the house up in Victoria Road, Bellevue Hill. We had Ada Althouse used to come along and sing and play the piano, and then Hilda Grace also sing, but she was a marvellous pianist. And we had another chap named George Manuel. He used to come out regularly. He was a very, very good tenor. The artists used to all come out, and none of them got paid, with the exception of a couple of times where someone wanted to advertise something, and I used to charge them anything. All I used to get them to do was to pay the artists. And those artists that used to come along free for me used to get paid for once when we had something like that on.
Tell me about your neighbours at Bellevue Hill. How did they take to these 80-foot masts appearing?
I only had trouble with one neighbour. I had a neighbour next door there. Although we had curtains and everything else up to cut the noise down to an absolute minimum, he still complained, and he had an empty kerosene tin and a great big stick, and he used to stand right next to the fence and with the kerosene tin over the top of the fence there, bashing hell out of it all the time we were broadcasting. He'd stay there for an hour or more. He wrote complaints to the council, and the Wallara Council town clerk came up to see me about it, and he had a few bright ideas. He said that you're not allowed to put up radio masts and that without council permission. I said, oh, yeah. I said, can you put up a flagpole? He said, oh, yes, it's quite okay to put the flagpole up. I said, right, I'll put the flag on the top of both poles. So he didn't know what to do about that. Anyhow, this chap kept complaining, and every time we had live artists there, although we had curtains up to keep the noise down, we could still hear him bashing the kerosene tin right against the fence, and the fence was only about 2 or 3 feet away from the window, and you couldn't stop all the noise. Some of it was being picked up by the microphones.
Eventually, Otto Sandel was forced to move his station to the city. 2UW became a commercial station. One of the legendary moments in amateur broadcasting circles in Melbourne is Burt Maddock's broadcast of a swearing cockatoo. Ivor Morgan missed recording this broadcasting highlight, but it did get a mention, along with Marconi, in the ABC's 1946 feature, The Hams.
Hello, listeners. This is Experimental Station 3EF Elwood. Now we have a new announcer for you, a feathered one. Yes, this is the most famous cockatoo in St Kilda, and his owner has kindly brought him along to let you hear him. Now, Cocky, say hello to the listeners. Come on. Hello, Cocky. Say hello.
Maybe he's a bit shy. Come on, Cocky. Hello. Hello. Cocky, want a drink? Cocky, want a drink? Well, that's funny. Not a word. He chatters all the time, no?
Well, perhaps he's mic shy. I'm sorry, listeners. He's just ruffling out his feathers and...
Oh, here he goes. Hello, boy.
What's the matter with you? You Popeye, lot of blazing.
Unfortunately, the day it happened, Mr. Maddock couldn't get to the control switch as quickly as we did, and listeners were rewarded, or shocked, with as fine a flow of language as any bullock driver could wish to command. The next morning, the Chief Inspector of Wireless, Mr. J. Malone, and well-loved friend of every ham, stated with a twinkle in his eye,
So far, I haven't received an official report. But my department will go thoroughly into the matter. If necessary, the cockatoo will be brought into my office and questioned.
Leigh Cranch was second operator to Bill Sievers. Their broadcasts often relayed overseas radio stations for the local listeners. But one week their highly sensitive receiver broke down and couldn't be repaired in time for the scheduled broadcast.
We announced on the Saturday that due to matters beyond our control, we could not relay the Japanese station, but as an alternative, we'd do a rebroadcast from China and thus keep faith with our listeners. Bill and I now applied our true amateur talents. We had no idea whatsoever of an existing Chinese broadcasting station, so we created one ourselves. Firstly, Bill managed to fit a switch which would reverse the direction of rotation of our gramophone motor. We then drilled a new spindle hole about 3/4 of an inch off-centre in an old 10-inch disc on which was recorded mainly voice and a bit of music. This was placed on the turntable using the off-centre position for the spindle, and after the announcements of the big rebroadcast from China, the whole thing was played off-centre, inside out, and back to front. Talk about a Chinese broadcast, it was near perfect.
They used to play records, play them back to back, and sometimes off-centre, drill a hole off-centre of the record, and play it like that.
How do you mean off-centre?
Well, it was no music at all. It sort of up and down like a fashion like that, just an experiment. And one particular amateur...
What, by hand? Winding it round by hand? So...
Yeah. Just to show how funny we can be. I mean, you say you had a typical... I used to... Most of the chaps used to use... Now, you probably want to know how we do the transmission of records over the air, right? Now, in those days, there used to be you used to have a cabinet type of record player and to wind it up. Well, we used to put the microphone, getting back to the old microphone or the telephone took off the telephone, and put that right inside the horn of the gramophone and play it that way. Mind you, it wasn't very elaborate, but it worked all right.
Mai Sievers first met Bill on a blind date and then was a regular visitor to the Sunday afternoon radio concerts.
There used to be about 20 of us get there, different ones, fellas and girls and that, and we'd all talk. And that's where I first met Stevens. No, that's right. And Ray Woods, and that's where they used to do their announcing there.
So it was quite an event with people, social occasion.
Oh, yes, it was quite a bit of a thrill and that, and we'd all have a talk and that. And then I eventually started to go out with Billy, and I'd stay overnight, and then he would go on the air later, and I would sort of announce and that, and play records, and that's where they wanted to ring up and know who the little girl was, because I had such a girlish voice.
30 request numbers tonight. Those we have not been able to satisfy we'll try and get next week. Well, our final number is the Nuns Chorus from Casanova. If there's anybody who would like to give a report on this transmission, would they please ring FU 1369. FU 1369.
Different people would ring up, and they'd say, or perhaps during the week, some of the girls at work would say to me, oh, will you play such and such a number for us on Sunday? And I'd say, oh, well, if Billy's got it, okay, we'll play it. And then I'd play it, and I might say, oh, well, here you are, Joan, or Dorothy, whatever it is, here's your record that you asked for.
We were not allowed to put over the air the make of record that we played. That was advertising. Now, we got into trouble once before because the listener in wrote each amateur and asked them what their program was for Sunday. And we wrote and told them, and they gave them the information, plus the name of the record. The copyright people got to hear of it and wanted to charge us a fee. So we all trooped up to the Herald office, had a good old talk up there. Eventually everything was fixed up, that the amateurs would be allowed to transmit, but still don't mention the make of record. But you can do it over the telephone if you want to, which we did quite often.
You'd mentioned the title and the artist.
Oh, yes, and you say that, but not the make of record. No, sir. And yet the funny part about it, you're right, funny part about it, most of those records I played were obtained for quite a few of the record people in the city, plus movies, talkies when they were out. They used to send me records of various plays that's coming on and all that. And I used to, and not only that, it was one particular station, amateur station, I used to borrow records from that he would use on a Saturday night, and I'd go down to a Sunday and pick them up from here. But just the same, we sold quite a lot of records that way, because when they rang up on the phone, you tell them the make of the record and where you got them from.
Oh, yes. Well, we had thousands of people over the period of the 6 years who came down just to see it and to see a radio station being operated. And we puddled along with the knowledge we had in putting over this and putting over that, playing the records, telling them to keep quiet because we didn't have any red light on the microphone. Oh, that was another thing too. You see, the transmitter was out in... he had a transmitting room which was at the other side of the garage. A special room built for it, and the studio was in the house, right? So when... I didn't have any switch on the microphone at all. He used to control that, the microphone and the music, one after the other, from the amplifier that he had in the shed. And if he forgot to turn it onto the microphone, well, then we didn't get anything. But he used to turn it over to the microphone and then back to the record, over to the microphone, back to the record. And then there was this particular night about something or other, and we had one hell of a bust-up. And he came into the room and forgot to switch the microphone off, you see. And the whole thing was broadcast, you see. We were in the, I don't know, we yelled at each other about something or other, and it must have been great entertainment for the people listening in, because they got the whole bit right through from the start to finish, he ticking me off and me ticking him off, and there it was. So that was something that was one of those unwritten things that are still floating around in space somewhere.
Val Harris, an amateur from Western Australia.
I got letters from all over the ruddy state about this, and at that time I was interested in recordings, always been mad on music. I had a lot of Larry Adler's records and Robeson, all those sort of stuff, particularly Larry Adler's, and people liked those Larry Adler records, harmonica stuff. I used to put a lot of that on. And this'll make you laugh. I was using an 8-inch electromagnetic speaker for a microphone. And it all went over like a ton of bricks. And my wife at that time used to play the banjo. I used to put her on there to break in between the records. Oh, I used to have a lot of fun.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
You have a very nice cafe here. Would it be possible for me to have a hot meal?
Yes, sir. Right this way, sir. There you are. I suppose you haven't eaten anything for a couple of hours or so, eh? Has your order been taken, sir?
No, not yet. What's on?
Here's the both of us, sir.
The what?
The menu.
Oh, yes. Now, I think I'll have, what's this? Pâté du foie gras.
Yes.
Oh, I'll have that anyhow.
Yes, sir. Beef steak, eggs and chips, Joe. Lovely weather we're having for this time of the year, sir. As a rule, we get 9 months' rain and the wet season sets in. Do you take tea, sir?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
What kind do you prefer, China, Indian, or Ceylon?
Oh, anything. Say Ceylon.
Yes, sir. Milk or lemon?
Oh, milk, please.
Very good, sir. Ayrshire, Jersey, or Guernsey?
Oh, I don't mind. Any sort of milk does me.
Very good, sir.
And shake that steak up.
Yes, sir. Wallop the steak, Joe.
I don't mean that. I mean hurry up with the thing. I haven't all day to sit here.
Rightio, sir. Your cup and choices, sir. We always give a free teacup reading after you finish your meal, sir.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yes, sir. You'll be surprised at some of the things we'll tell you.
I'm sure I would be surprised. Say, you've given me 2 knives.
Oh, yes. Well, you see, we're out of forks at the moment, sir.
The department didn't mind because you were getting experience, and that's what they wanted, you see. So amateurs, in my opinion, are still around, not because of all the other things that they do, but because basically the authorities are aware of the fact that they have a virtually inexhaustible pool of technical ability. And that's why amateurs still have some territory. Of course, what a lot of people don't know is that, I'm talking about the general public, is that nearly every one of the bands that have been opened up, amateurs opened up, not the authorities, not the physics departments and so forth, amateurs. They did all the hard work, and as soon as they got one of these bands functional and working, they took it away from us and left us with a lousy little bit of territory about this size, you see. This went on and on and on. They're still at it.
A few years after the war, some amateurs were still trying to get back on the air to present their concerts. Bill Sievers.
We certainly had some great times, and I believe the public thoroughly enjoyed our programs. They were made really from stations using their own gear, their own time, and expense, of course, was not thought of. But it was enjoyable, and we certainly had great times using the Sunday's transmissions from one weekend to another. We hope, or we are trying to get back, but it looks a forlorn hope. So, although we have had asked by numerous people when we came back on the air again, I'm afraid those days have gone.
In loudspeakers, you heard Otto Sandel, Ivor Morgan, Walter Exton, Bert Maddock, Leigh Cranch, Bill and Mai Sievers and Val Harris. Our thanks to Mrs. Ilse Morgan and Chris Long for archival material used in this program. The interview with Charles McClurkin is from the ABC's radio archives. The program included excerpts from the Wireless Institute of Australia's cassette The Sounds of Amateur Radio, and the rare recordings of the amateur broadcasters in Melbourne are from the Ivor Morgan collection at the Performing Arts Museum in Melbourne. And thanks to Walter Exton for the recordings of music and talks he made at his father's station 2XN in Lismore. In the next program, Making Radio Pay, we'll hear more about early broadcasting and how radio was sold over the air and door to door. Music for the series was written and performed by Kathy Peters. Readings by Scott McGregor and Michelle Forden. Production of Bright Sparks by Sharon Davis, Judy Lowry and Stephen Rapley for the ABC's Social History Unit.
You have been listening to experimental station VK3BY Melbourne. And that will conclude the transmission from the station for tonight. The station is owned and operated by the Holt brothers of 27 Bamborough Road, Caulfield, SE7. And all reports, accompanied by the usual postage, will be suitably acknowledged. The station is now closing down until next Sunday dinner time at 12:30, when the usual test program will be transmitted. 3BY Melbourne now closing down.
Do you realize that with one of his master's voice, all-wave or dual-wave receivers, you can go around the world without leaving your most comfortable armchair?
The ABC's Social History Unit presents Making Radio Pay, the fifth program in the series Bright Sparks, Australian Radio Stories, compiled by Stephen Rapley.
By just turning the knob of your His Master's Voice instrument, you can listen to fascinating programs from all over the world. You might hear a film star from Hollywood, Maurice Chevalier.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to sing a song from my last picture, The Beloved Vagabond.
Each pretty little peach growing out of reach in the nursery.
Before radio could be used to sell products, it had to sell itself. It had to create its audience and its market. People were drawn to radio retailing from trades as diverse as piano tuners and pastry cooks. The boom in broadcast receiver sales during the 1930s was a long time coming, especially for the more optimistic investors. After the First World War, AWA's director and general manager Ernest Fisk focused his company's efforts on maritime wireless and international communications. According to the late Philip Jeeves, former company archivist at AWA, the demand for a broadcasting service from the growing army of experimenters and enthusiasts didn't really fit into their corporate plan.
Fisk didn't really believe in broadcasting. He used to refer to it as Publicity Wireless, and that was damning it out of hand, really, with faint praise. The other curious thing was that this corporate feeling about broadcasting spread throughout the company rather like a contagion. And AWA had a reputation not for establishing broadcasting stations, but acquiring what finally turned out to be a radio network rather by default, because they built stations for prospective licensees who suddenly discovered that the world was not waiting for the arrival of a new station at Mossvale or Goulburn or Albury, and that they had expended a lot of their money, sunk a lot of capital into setting up a facility that the public really couldn't care less about. And the principal deterrent to this, of course, was the cost of radio receivers. And here AWA was again making the money because it was building receivers and was selling them at the optimum price to suit themselves. And the payment of the patent rights on receivers in those days was a very high figure indeed, and consequently it couldn't be said that the cost of a radio set was negligible to the average Australian household. And so, as I say, by default, AWA began collecting commercial stations, principally because they built them for other people who had grandiose ideas of providing entertainment to country communities, and then suddenly found that they couldn't pay for the station, so AWA had to take them over, and since the license was operative, they had to operate the station.
AWA tended to appoint its former ship's wireless operators as managers of its radio stations. The company's different vision of what radio might be is best illustrated by the short-lived sealed set scheme. Subscribers paid for a receiver which could be tuned to only one station. W.J. McClarty was the publisher of Wireless Weekly and the managing director of station 2SB, later 2BL, the first of the official broadcasters to go on the air.
In 1923, the famous Seal Set conference was held. I represented Wireless Weekly at that conference, and the conference of about 60 or 80 people in all states that were interested in wireless were addressed by Mr. Ernest Fisk, who really hypnotized his audience and persuaded them all, as he had just returned from overseas, that the best method was by sealed sets. And the conference, therefore, recommended to the government that the first broadcasting should be done with sealed sets. To obtain a license, one had to pay a fee of 12 6 to the government. That is for one service only. So if you want, our service at 2SB was free, but farmer service you had to pay an extra 4 guineas for. As at that time it was practically impossible to make a set that would only receive one service, things became chaotic, and later on this was altered.
The government introduced a sealed set system whereby you paid a license for your 10 shillings, but your set was tuned to either one station or the other, either 3AR or 3LO. But that didn't last very long because the school kids gradually began to learn a little bit about radio, and they still had their sets converted that they could listen to either station. So the government canned that idea, and they brought in a system of 10 6 for an ordinary radio license to listen to either station.
Rupert Fitz, one of the founders of 3AR. The sealed sets episode was really only a marketing hiccup for radio. 1,400 licenses had been taken out under the scheme, but hundreds more listened in surreptitiously. Radio was still at the stage where it had to create and maintain a high level of excitement amongst its potential listeners. Stunts became the order of the day, with each station vying to outdo its rivals and take the microphone to more bizarre and unpredictable places.
Some of the things that we were first in at 2BL was talking back, which is considered something new today, but in those days, J.M. Prentice used to answer questions, and the whole conversation of a person ringing up and J.M. Prentice's answer was broadcast. We were the first station to ever broadcast a 3-act play. We were the first station to broadcast from Jenolan Caves, the first station to broadcast from the Snowy, the first station to broadcast from an aeroplane, the first to give time signals, which was the GPO clock every 15 minutes. We also broadcasted from a mine at Katoomba with Welsh miners singing choruses in the mine. The first theatre play was broadcast by 2BL. That was The Student Prince. And also St. Mary's Cathedral Carillon.
I want you to imagine a man has just bought a new radio, and he's one of these typical dial twisters who is never satisfied with one program. You hear the news, a dramatic play, the market prices, and London, England. But really, he doesn't care what program he gets. He just loves to turn on the radio, and this is what happens when he turns it on. It was officially reported this evening that Mr. Neville Chamberlain stated in the House of Commons, "Oh, Dora, my darling Dora, you know how much I love you." "Oh, but Francis, it cannot be so." "Oh, but don't you hear the sound of sweet music?" "Dora, if you would only come with me, the sights that we could see."
5,000 hogs and 3,000 sheep. Some hogs active, others slow.
How is your stomach? If you have an acid stomach, why don't you enjoy Teddy White and his Hawaiian singers and players?
It was about that time that someone, I think it was the local storekeeper, who probably had more money than most, he was the person, I think, who bought and installed the first radio in the town. And it was a wondrous experience. He used to leave the doors open and let this thing play, and you'd go for a walk at night and be able to hear it and so on, in the silence, of course.
What silence?
The silence of the town, because there were no motor cars going through. All the motor cars had been put away, both of them. And just the occasional train through, but just total silence apart from wind noise or anything like that. A radio, you could hear it streets away, even though they weren't very loud in those days, but nevertheless you could hear it. My grandfather also bought a radio in the early days. At first he had a pair of headphones, and the way you listened to it was that you'd take the headphones apart, and one person would have one phone held up to their ear, and the other person would hold the other one up to their ear, and you'd pass it round if there were more than two people present. Then he brought a loudspeaker, which is then known as a Brown's table talker. It was rather like an overgrown loudspeaker sitting flat on its back on the table, with a long elongated horn coming up and standing vertically above it, and coming to a wide mouth, of course. And it allowed people in the room to hear what was going on from this overgrown headphone, really, Brown's table talker. Those are the first two radios that I remember.
Radio had the greatest impact on people living in the country. Neville Williams remembers the time before radio was common in the town where he grew up, Bargo, in New South Wales.
It was isolated. Our papers had to come by train. They only arrived sometime much later in the day, and therefore there was no immediacy about news. There was no radio. There was no immediacy about news at all. Things happened in the big city that incredibly weren't often reported locally until much, much later. I remember on one occasion, I think this was about 1926 odd, when the working hours were changed from 48 to 44 hours, and that meant working days were dropped from 6 to 5.5. Now, you'd have thought that everybody would have known about that pending change, but I remember very vividly on the Saturday when this came about, and I was in the garden of our little farmlet with my mother around lunchtime on Saturday when chut, 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 my father arrived back home on his motorbike, and my mother went quite grey because she thought he's lost his job. But he didn't look as if he's lost his job. And when he finally pulled up, he explained that he was home early because they'd cut the working hours, and in future he would only have to work 5.5 days. And the first time he'd heard about it was when he got to work that day. That's the sort of isolation I'm talking about.
The first station in Western Australia was 6WF, owned by a farmers' cooperative, Westralian Farmers. George Moss.
Australian Farmers was originally set up as a cooperative for country farmers, and they made their purchases mainly through Australian Farmers, and of course got a dividend from the profits which the cooperative made every year. And so when Australian Farmers set up they obtained the radio wireless license in those days for the broadcast transmitter. They had a ready-made market of customers in the country to whom they could market their sets, and it worked out very well.
The sets sold to farmers to receive 6WF were known as Mulga phones. Another well-known brand from the West was the Beatty phone.
Stan Beatty, an old mate of mine. Stan was the initiator of the package deal. He would sell you the complete set which he made on his own premises, 2 lengths of 3x2 inch timber for the masts, the copper wire to go between to make the aerial, the insulators to insulate the aerial from the masts, and the whole thing was there packaged for you. The batteries to go, of course, the battery operation in those days, no power sets. And he sold a lot of sets, and he used to go around the country himself, installing and erecting them, go from farm to farm, putting them up, and he was a pretty busy man for a while.
I should tell you that one of the many advantages of his Master's Voice radio is that it is very simple to operate. The large edge-lit dial makes tuning in a real pleasure. It's easy to read, easy to follow. Let us now pick up the transmissions which cross the Pacific. From South America, you might hear the exotic rumbo from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil.
Broadcasting stations boosted radio as an exciting new technology able to conquer distance. The press joined the campaign, reporting each new achievement, such as the first shortwave reception of overseas stations in 1925.
Frank Goldsmith, who was then a reporter on the Daily News, had the job of going around daily to the workplaces of the various amateurs and getting reports from them, what they heard the night before, and writing it up in his daily column. And I still have some of the column cuttings. Column inches must have been very cheap in those days, because on several days he'd have a whole column in the paper listing the results the various amateurs received. I feature in some of them. He used to come and get my report too, and I still see him rushing up the stairs to the workshop where I was working and then getting my story and then rushing down again off to the next one. Frank got so engrossed in amateur radio by his contact in this that he eventually became an amateur himself and became VK6FG, FG for Frank Goldsmith.
Ted Huckle was a pioneer radio retailer in Sydney. He started out building and selling small shortwave receivers in the late 1920s.
I used to put the set in the car. It was a battery-operated set, and knock on the door of the house at about 10 o'clock. And so I brought the set. They'd already paid the £10. I'd go into, say, the living room or the breakfast room or wherever they were at a table, put it on the table, and pull out a length of wire about 100 feet and go to the closest window and drop it out the window, and then go around the back garden and pick up the coil of wire and usually put it right along the top of the adjoining fence next door. It's easy to do. You hang it up anywhere, it doesn't matter. And go back inside, switch the set on, hear the noise on the headphones, and very close up to coming to 10:30. You hear the noise of the clock, and just as you know it was going to strike, you pull the headphones out of the plug and it comes on the loudspeaker. Enough to fill the room, enough to fill the house. Big Ben, bang. It's a sensation. It's a marvellous sensation. The people there, they're English people, nearly always English people. And they're thrilled to pieces. Big Ben. You can recognise it again. You go through the news, you've sold the set, there it is. You show them how to change it over to the local stations.
So were they easy to sell then, at 10:30 at night?
Oh, they were easy to sell, but you didn't have very many people with £10 to spend on short waves, that's all. No, it wasn't a good business.
Hello, Melbourne.
We are now going to rebroadcast an item from 5SW Chelmsford, England. Now, boys and girls, you remember I told you about the silence of the boy? How difficult it was for him to get a job. Well, now I'm going to tell you about the honest little boy. Now, the honest little boy, when he left home, I'm a job for him. So they made him steward at the home. Now, what was that nice for him? The L.O. Melbourne, the item you have just heard was a song, O Peaceful Night, sung by the Russian prima donna, Madame Nora Irzov, rebroadcast by us from 5SW Chelmsford, England. Very clever.
Regarding demonstrations, we've found in the past that once we're allowed to demonstrate our Model 20, or any of our sets in the house, we take it there and leave it there for a night or two and then come back and say, Mr. Jones, how's the machine? And he says, not too bad, here's your cheque. The sale is made. Once we are able to show our machine and let the people hear the wonderful tone and results and the ease of control, we, in every case, make a sale. I very often find it advisable to leave the machine in the home and then say, we will call back for it tomorrow or in 2 or 3 days' time. When we go, they have a little experiment themselves, and they find they can bring in Adelaide, and they say, this is a wonderful machine. If we let it go over a week, we find the novelty is gone, and they say, £50 is a lot of money, we'll stick to the money, and we lose the sale.
I got my sign writer to put up a sign. It was 100 square feet. It was on an angle that you could read it easily for a quarter of a mile away because it only had one word on it, R-A-D-I-O. And it was 3 feet high and 15 feet long each way. So you couldn't miss it. It was a radio shop. And I put a clock there. It was the only clock between Manly and Ross, and it had radio on it.
Ted Huckle's radio shop in Cremorne became famous locally for its elaborate window displays.
Now, my main conception was publicity. I was a corner shop, and you could see it for 100 feet away. And it had to be well lit. I used 100-watt spotlights with plenty of reflecting direction right down onto the floor. I used to do a lot of window displays. When anything was going in town, like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs or anything like that, I'd follow the general direction of what was popular. For instance, when Smithy got lost, I had a big map of Australia, and I spotted it up with bright lights. And I put a bulletin board on the side of the window to write bulletins on what I received from the news and anything I received over radio, because very few people had radio. I don't know, they might have a crystal set or something like that, but there wasn't a radio in every home by any means. And they used to come to the shop for news.
I don't know how most people listened, but certainly the way that we did in 1932-33 was on a crystal set that my father had made, years before, which was made in a cigar box. I still associate early days of radio with the smell of Cuban cigar boxes. The problem, of course, that you've probably heard of, is that you had a crystal which was a lump of galena, a piece of blue-sheened lead sulfide, and there was a brass wire that you had to find a sensitive spot on the galena, and that you adjusted. Adjusted is the wrong word. You had to pick a bit here, pick a bit there, until you got the best spot. And then you would hope that nobody would walk through the room, slam the door. It caused dreadful family ructions if somebody walked through the room while you were listening to the radio. And they were the conditions that we listened to radio in those days. 1935, when we were starting to come out of the Depression, we actually bought ourselves a mantle radio, and that was a great day when you could get volume out of the thing.
Well, you've got to attract people, and you put one near the door that looks all right, and you put 14 guineas on it, see? And it costs 10, you're only making £4. That's to get the person to come into the shop. And he comes into the shop to buy the 14 guinea set, and to make the set not such a good tone, we used to put a 0.5 condenser in the bypass of the second detector to spoil the sound, so the sound wasn't full and round and everything that you'd like. He'd come into the shop and he'd look at the set and he'd want to buy that set because it was 14 guineas, and you turn it on and you'd listen to it, and he'd be quite satisfied himself, not knowing anything. And then you take him round and show them the better-looking cabinets in the shop, and you tell him, you're not buying the set for the cabinet. You can put it in a soap box and get a good set. But if you've got a better set, you'll give it a better cabinet. In consequence, the sets on the stands in the shop were better sets than the one at the door. That's why they were higher in price. They were 18 guineas, not 14. And they're more expensive to build, and they're a better cabinet, and all that sort of thing, and it all goes with and makes your home look better because it's a better looking set, and it makes your home sound better because it's a better sounding set. So you put a 0.5 condenser in a second detector. But in the boot sets, the only difference is that it's a 25 microfarad. Instead of a 0.5 microfarad goes in the detector, and it gives you the full flavour of the sound.
You told me someone bought the
Yes,
set.
yes, the bloke bought it. He went out and installed it. He wanted a 14 guinea set. He got a 14 guinea set. And about 18 months afterwards, Jack said, he came in for some defect he wanted. And he said, this is the bloke who's bought the 14 guinea set. About the only one. And, I said, don't be bloody lousy. He can put a 25 mic in a detector stage. So he got the real sound. That's only a trick.
Ted Huckle and Neville Teal. When Walter Exton worked at his father's commercial station 2XN in Lismore, New South Wales, he had to teach himself new skills, from looking after the members of the Kookaburra Club to writing advertising copy.
I think we must have had about 100 or more children in this session, and we would take them out on Saturday afternoons for picnics, a run out into the country, in buses, incidentally. And the buses, we acquired the use of the buses by giving advertising to the bus management in each case, which didn't cost us anything, because we didn't have anything. Anyhow, the point is that we would take them out to the country, out to, say, a farm this Saturday, or we'd take them for a picnic in the park. I don't remember who supplied the sandwiches, but we always had them. But it was the same thing over and over again. We would go to the pictures sometimes. And there again, the pictures were always free to us because they used to take it out in advertising. And this was a great thing. We got a lot of money in.
The ABC Social History Unit presents Soldering On, the sixth program in the series Bright Sparks, Australian Radio Stories, compiled by Stephen Rapley.
I was sitting for what was then known as the Leaving Certificate. I couldn't get my mind off radio. I studied all my other subjects purely as drudgery, but I was really sold on radio. That's all I could think about. And I managed to get through the exams and all that sort of thing, but straight after that, back to radio. I only wanted to play with radio. It was quite an obsession.
The 1930s was a boom period for the radio set makers in Australia. Radio was seen more and more as a cheaper source of entertainment and news, and not such a luxury or marvel. By the end of the 30s, 2 out of 3 homes would have a radio, and that's not counting the unlicensed listeners. According to radio historian Jack Ross, the turning point for the industry was around 1934.
there were a number of major technical developments which really changed things. Nearly all receivers up until about 1930 or a little bit thereafter were battery receivers, which made it extremely difficult for people to operate these things because of the high costs. And also the particular circuitry that was used at the time there. Most of the circuits were what they called tuned radio frequency or Nutridyne and a few others, and they were extremely difficult for the non-technical householder to operate. You needed to turn about 3 or 4 dials separately, and you'd spend half an hour trying to get a station. And even when you did, the damn thing would be howling and bursting into oscillation, and if you lived closer into the city there, every time it burst into oscillation, of course, your neighbour suffered, and you'd hear him screaming out about that kid next door with his wireless or something like that. Anyhow, about that 34, a new type of circuit, although it had been developed many, many years before by Edward Armstrong of FM fame, the superheterodyne, by 1934 the manufacturers had realised the potential of that circuit, and they pulled out all stops and developed it to a high level of efficiency. And come 1934, I think every manufacturer in Australia, and there were a lot of them, were marketing superheterodyne receivers. And of course that's the type of circuit that's still in use today. Now that really brought about a change in things, because all you had to do was to turn one knob to tune in a station, and you could get any station you wanted to with just that one knob instead of 2 or 3. Also the numbers of receivers tended to increase rapidly. I think they're getting over the Depression. People had a few more pounds around to spend on these things, and because the manufacturers were producing more and more receivers, the prices were tending to fall. They were also producing small units, midgets or table models there, that allowed these things to be in the kitchen where the lady of the house could hear the programs too, which meant that she could in fact listen to programs like the serials and that there that she wouldn't have done had she had to stop work and go into the lounge room.
Let the 3D be, there'll always be, every night your cheerful company. You'll be there, we'll be there, with a melody that's sure to cure the blues. 3D's little worry with a smile, they will leave you in a little while. To every sigh, say goodbye, then contented you will be. Smile away, smile and drive down care away. 3DB Melbourne, Kettle Broadcasting Service. I see a delightful...
The local radio industry was protected by a tariff barrier set up in 1930. This limited the import of cheaper sets and components from America, Britain and Europe. As well as the giants like AWA, many small factories, often employing only a dozen workers, sprang up all over the country. Receivers were built in backyards and tiny workshops in every town, and many young enthusiasts began their radio careers on the factory assembly line. Neville Williams, for a long time editor of the magazine Radio and Hobbies, started out at the factory of Reliance Radio in York Street, Sydney.
A very old 3-storey building with a basement, and like most of the buildings of that age in that area, it was rat infested. They did their best to clean it up and keep it clean and so on, but it was a very old building. I was one of 2, actually. They put on another wire very shortly afterwards, who was just as crazy about radio as I was. We were both required to work for £1 a week, which is about $2 a week, but we both thought that we were in heaven, because here we were mad on radio, and here was Messrs. Craven and Wild willing to pay us money to work at it. And we were so mad on it that we'd start at 8 o'clock in the morning, I think it was. We'd come to lunchtime at 12 or thereabouts. We'd have our lunch, and then we'd have half an hour to spare, so why waste it? So we'd get back to the bench and keep on doing what we wanted to do, and through till 5 o'clock, whenever it was at night.
Arthur Spring started his career at Crown Radio's factory.
It was a deadly sort of a place, really. It was dark, and it was so damn dark. And we had this little hole at the back, little room. It was not much bigger than a bush dunny, really. And there was only one skylight up at the top. And of course, aeroplanes in those days weren't all that frequent. When one came low over there one day, lugubrious Arthur Spring wanted to have a look at it. He leaned forward to look out through the skylight, trod on his soldering iron cord, and you know what happens. It goes on the floor. You know what happens next, of course, when you reach down in the dark to pick it up. You pick it up by the wrong end. It slipped out of my hand. I couldn't understand that until I felt the sting. Yeah, anyhow, that's how dark it was.
A factory was big and roomy and airy. I think there wasn't much of a problem with ventilation. Holidays were non-existent. You just took it for granted that you worked right through the year, that you didn't have such a thing as annual leave. That wasn't known in the workforce, and I think if anybody wanted to take a holiday, you'd have had to beg time off without pay. We just didn't have holidays.
Elizabeth Wallace worked in a more spacious factory in Adelaide at the National Radio Corporation. She was the first woman in South Australia to become a radio amateur, and when she joined National, she worked as a tester.
Conditions of work were regarded as quite reasonable, quite comfortable. Although we didn't have holidays, the hours of work were not considered excessive, or at least I didn't find it so, because I'd been working in shop work, and shops working longer hours than the factory. So, but we did have to work on Saturday mornings. You had to go in on Saturday mornings, I think for 3 or 4 hours. You worked half a day on Saturdays, and it was very great advance, I think, in industries generally when the 5-day week was introduced.
There's no such thing as fans or air conditioners or anything like that. You were more or less on an assembly line, and a lot of the assembly lines, you had a certain amount of the set to do, and then when you finished that, it went on to the next fella. But they were arranged in timed intervals, so that when the time was up, you had to be ready to pass it to the next one, and that's how they done it.
During the 30s, George Mann worked at a number of radio factories, like Reliance, STC, Britain, Tasma, and Airzone.
When I worked at Airzone, we had 3-minute intervals. The set had to be passed every 3 minutes to the next one, but you didn't have a terrible lot of work to do. Of course, you couldn't do a lot in 3 minutes, but it was all arranged so that you'd have one operator would be poking the wires in the sockets and twisting them around, and the next operator, all he'd have was a soldering iron. He used to just go bang, 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 bang and solder all the joints, you see. And then up to the end of the line, at Airzone, I was working on the end of the line, and it was my job to wire up one socket, I think, audio socket or something like that, and then just clasp my eyes all quickly all through the set to see if there's any joints that weren't missed, and then pass it on to the test rooms for testing.
In 3 minutes?
3 minutes, 3-minute operation. The unfortunate part about it was if you found you had to go to the toilet, well, then you were in a bit of bother, because the assembly line had to keep running. If you went to the toilet, you'd find that when you come back, what sets you should have done while you're at the toilet would be just put underneath your bench, and then you would stay back after work and clear the line. Of course, you got nothing for that. That was your fault, because you shouldn't have gone to the toilet in the boss's time. You should have gone in your own time, and that was the general rule with a lot of them. You couldn't stop the assembly line from running.
We're talking about a radio industry that was comparable with the rag trade for hire and general practices. That's just about how it stood.
What do you mean by hire and fire? Were there seasons, high seasons and low seasons?
Oh, it was worse than that. I mean, if we didn't have an order from Bebber Falls for unbranded radios next week, you were fired. It was as short as that. You were virtually on a 1 week basis. Yeah, it was all very short order.
Factories, in particular, the
the smaller factories tended to use the services of juniors, and of course the wages were quite low, and the tendency was that as soon as a person reached 21 and required senior wages, they were dismissed. That was quite common.
Keith Sherlock started his radio work in AWA's factory where they made loudspeakers.
Conditions weren't all that terribly bad. The factories were fairly comfortable, and although fairly primitive, I suppose, by modern standards, but we survived.
Could you sit when you were doing the work, or did you have to stand?
No, we could mainly sit. On some jobs, of course, it wasn't possible to sit, so you had to stand all day, which became pretty tiring.
How did you cope with the monotony of it, of that wiring, say? When you've got to actually concentrate and do it correctly.
Yes, well, you had to do that, and I suppose it was you could sort of put your mind in neutral and go through the motions and think of your hobbies and maybe your friends, your girlfriends, and so on. But it was a pretty boring existence. Any sort of mass production was. In some of the slack times, I actually worked for the Ford Motor Company, and they of course had a production line, and you had to keep up with that production line or else, and you didn't have much time to dash around and talk to your mates. It was just a case of keeping up as best you could. Otherwise, you'd find that there'd be someone else there in your place the next day. That was the sort of thing you had to put up with. There's always someone at the door waiting to take your job if you were negligent in any way.
I can remember quite well at Air Zone, you always found 3 or 4 fellows sitting out the front of the factory. And the idea was if anybody that was on the assembly lines wasn't up to standard and he got the bullet, well, there was always another fellow sitting out the front ready to take his place. And this was something that went on in those days, but you'd never believe that, but that was actual fact. Yeah.
It wasn't a permanent occupation. It was very seasonal work during the winter time, and in the slack period of the summer, we either had to go for an enforced holiday or find another factory around the place where there was a little work available.
See, what happened with the factories is over the Christmas period, the factories would actually shut down, and they would only keep a very, very skeleton staff on, perhaps a couple of engineers or a foreman or something like that, and they would be busy designing the sets for the next year, because over the summer months the sale of radios dropped off considerably. So over the Christmas months you weren't employed, you were out of work, and I used to go to a restaurant out at Bondi. A chap I knew had a restaurant out at Bondi, and over the Christmas period, to get a few bob for Christmas, I used to go out there, and my job was to go down to the markets and get the fowls, and then come back again and pluck them and clean them for the restaurant. That was interesting work, I suppose, in one respect, that I was grateful for it, because if it hadn't been for that, I'd have been broke over the Christmas period, and then round about end of February towards March, the factories would get back into production, so you'd start looking around to get back into the factory again. If you're lucky enough, you got back in again, and away you went for perhaps another 6 months in the factory till they closed down again over the Christmas period.
It was very seasonal, yeah, indeed, yeah. It was so that you dreaded the passing of your wonderful Christmas holiday break, and tailing off into February and what we call the Ides of March. The Ides of March. Oh dear. And if you were able to get through the Ides of March without being sacked, you counted your blessings, because that was really the low period of the year. And there was always the release of new models and or some other such activity going on, which would tend to boost the business. But yes, midwinter was a most active time. simply because people were buying their radios to listen to around the fireplace, you know, and stay home. That's simple as that, the domestic scene.
Radio had become so popular that parts and whole receivers simply disappeared from the factories.
There was a lot of parts used to get stolen from the factories. There's no two ways about that. When I worked at STC, the amount of stuff that went out of STC was unreal. And there was a chap working there with us, and I said to a mate of mine, or I don't know, well, I think the mate of mine said to me, he said, "Do you know this chap at all?" I said, "No, I don't." But I said, if my judgment is correct, I said, "I think he's a detective." I said, you'll find he'll be working here amongst us boys, and I said, he'll be talking to us. I said, and the next thing I said, you'll find he'll disappear. And this is precisely what happened. He worked in the factory with us for about a fortnight, maybe a little bit longer, I don't quite know. But we all said, "Where's Jack?" or Harry, I just forget what his name was, but he'd gone. He wasn't there anymore. His job was, he was from the police department, and he was there to find out what was going on. And the next thing, there was quite a few chaps got raided their homes and found all bits and pieces and everything else in them, of course. But the funny part about a lot of the chaps that worked in the radio trades in the early days, of course you didn't get much money, so there was a lot of thieving went on with stuff in radio factories, and with STC, of course, as I said, a lot of them were caught taking bits and pieces. But the stupid part about it was that they were actually stealing bits and pieces that were of no use for them. They had no idea what they were.
There wasn't a great deal of that went on. There were cases, I can remember, cases of people, for example, in one place I worked, there were two brothers, one on the day shift and one on the night shift, and the man on the day shift used to come round at night, and he'd be handed a few components or receivers over the fence by his brother or colleague, if that was the case. But no, there wasn't a lot of it went on.
I've heard of cases where, in some factories, where they almost had body searches.
Oh, well, yes, this used to happen at Tasma. Periodically, they'd put a search on, and you'd have to empty all the stuff out of your pockets and everything else before you went out the door, see whether you had anything in your pockets. But of course, if you got the wind of the fact that there was going to be a search on, of course there was nothing taken, and if you wanted to take anything, you went out the lavatory and poked it through the window of the lavatory down the lane at the back of the lavatory, and you collected it that way. But I wasn't in for pinching stuff from factories because it wasn't my nature and it wasn't my idea to pinch stuff, because I've seen that many of them getting caught, and I reckon I said to myself, it's just not worth it, you know. I was never into it, because of that reason.
The normal progression for promising young radio engineers might take them from assembly and wiring through to being an inspector, and then possibly a move up to testing. After this, it was to the laboratory, designing new sets, or over to the service area, looking after the difficult cases. Elizabeth Wallace was hired as a tester because of her technical skills, but in the early 30s, the radio factory was very much a male preserve.
They had names for everybody. Everybody had a nickname, and my nickname was Dillinger. Where they got Dillinger from, I don't know, but they called me Dillinger at any rate. And there was Long Tom, and there was all of them had nicknames, different names. And Long Tom, there's a big tall chap that worked alongside of me. He said, "Dillinger," he said, "you're wanted over in the cloakroom." I said, "Who wants me? What do they want?" He said, "Oh, I don't know. You have to go and find out, I suppose." So I went over the cloakroom to find out who wanted me, and only to find out there was about a dozen blokes here, and they grabbed me and pulled all my clothes off. And
all my private parts they smeared with solvent flux and threw me trousers down in the lane at the back of the factory. So I had to run out with nothing, no trousers on, and retrieve me trousers, and then make a hurried retreat into the washroom to clean myself up and get back to work again. That was me. Once that was over, I was right. I was initiated into the factory, and I was one of the mob sort of thing.
Women were employed in radio factories on mechanical assembly work, coil and transformer winding, and then soldering sets on the assembly line. According to the male engineers I spoke to, the theory was that women were more patient and accurate with repetitious tasks.
What used to be done in those days was for mass production, so-called, was that the girls wiring sets up would have in front of them what they called charts, which were cardboard, strawboard panels about 2 feet by 18 inches, and on these were drawn illustrations of the particular component parts that they had to fit into the chassis. The panel strip and the wires and the coloured wires and the capacitors and ta-ra. Well, apparently I showed enough artistic flair to be to be put to the task of drawing these things up, all in colour. Things were pretty basic, you know. But for one chassis, you had a pile of panels that was about 4 feet high, you know. It was quite a stack of these things because each individual step had to be so illustrated.
I was taken on there immediately and trained for aligning radio receivers, which was semi-technical work, and I was apparently the first woman they'd ever been able to train for that work. There were other girls on the factory line assembling, but they said they'd never been able to train any other woman to align a radio receiver, and so I used to enjoy that work very much.
Because of the work they did testing the receivers so that the stations were on the right spot on the dial, the testers worked in a special part of the factory.
We used to work in a shielded cage, a wire cage, which shielded the operating bench and the operator from outside interference, from electrical interference. There were 3 of us. There were 3 cages, and so there were 3 of us working full-time on aligning the radio sets. As far as I remember, it might have taken perhaps half an hour to align each receiver, because the alignment was always a bit of a compromise, trying to get reasonably even results over the whole span of the broadcast band, the whole spectrum.
So the other 2 aligners were men?
Yes.
Elizabeth Wallace finally left National Radio in Adelaide after working there for a couple of years and went on to become a maths and science teacher.
Testers, we were called. The people who were aligning radios were aligning and testing, and I think the male testers were getting about £5 a week. And yes, I was beginning to feel a bit disgruntled because I was only getting about 2. Yes, it was, looking back on it, it probably was slave labour, but I didn't see it as that way, and it was just that it was lowly paid. But the conditions were quite comfortable. There wasn't the pressure of work that there is in modern times. We just worked on at, at a reasonable rate, and that was it. And the atmosphere was quite friendly. The men were quite friendly, and I didn't notice any discrimination, although I think sometimes they must have felt that I'd perhaps be a threat to them if You know, if more females had come into the industry, that it could have been a threat to their £5 a week jobs if they could get people like me for £2 a week. But they never showed it to me. They never showed me any animosity at all.
While women were much cheaper to employ in the radio factories, a number of former engineers reported a strange experience.
Yeah, some of the sets began to play up and not make their specified figures, not by a long shot, until it was discovered that certain females at certain times of the month, if they were handling the bakelite base plate of these things, the perspiration on their hands disturbed the performance. One had to be terribly diplomatic about how you went about, finding out who and what was happening, and ta-ra, Anyway, I had the services of the female supervisor to help me track that one through. And indeed, certain people had to be taken onto other duties at certain times, because what would happen was that the leakage across the terminals was so high from body salts that it threw the whole thing quite out of whack. The AGC voltages would all go silly and the bias would go wonky and so on.
You were able to track it back.
Yeah, right. And there was virtually nothing I could do about it. I didn't find any treatment that would counteract that. We tried washing the bakelite in thinners and all the usual things you'd have around that you could safely apply to it, and we just scrapped them. Yeah. So, the same thing applies, of course, in coil winding, that they mustn't touch the wires or anything, otherwise you get green spots and things like that developing inside coils.
In Soldering On, you heard Neville Williams, Jack Ross, Arthur Spring, Elizabeth Wallace, George Mann and Keith Sherlock. In the next program, Calling All Cars, we'll hear about early police wireless, as well as other two-way radio operations like the Flying Doctor. Music for the series was written and performed by Kathy Peters. Production of Bright Sparks, Sharon Davis, Peter McLeod and Stephen Rapley for the ABC's Social History Unit.
I can distinctly remember Sir Ernest walking around through the factory and talking to people. He always had, of course, a number of followers, and they would be the management and some of the foremen in the factory. But I can quite distinctly remember the figure of Sir Ernest in the place, and he used to give us a Christmas present every year. The men would be given, I think, 100 cigarettes, and the girls in the factory would be given a box of chocolates. And that was from Sir Ernest Fisk, in appreciation of the work that we'd been doing through the year.
Tell them we're still calling on that one as well. And Flinders and Darlinghurst goes to the city, M7. 184. Okay, ringing for you. Roger. Come on, 2119. I've got all day to wait for your Roger. Thank you very much. What do we got there? The artillery goes to we already know that
The ABC's Social History Unit presents Calling All Cars, the 7th program in the series Bright Sparks, Australian Radio Stories, compiled by Stephen Rapley.
Die, die, die.
Over.
In its earliest days, radio was seen as a telephone without wires. Everyone would have access to the new technology. With radio, we could all talk to each other wherever we were. Some saw it ending the isolation of the people living in the outback. Others had visions of radio as an information network for the trade union movement. The original plan for the New South Wales Labour Council station 2KY envisaged two-way stations in every union branch, linking up with the central transmitter that would broadcast Labour lectures and commentaries. It also proposed a strong Morse code station to exchange crucial labour statistics about wages and unemployment with cities like Vienna, Moscow and Paris. But this dream of two-way radio didn't fit the dominant view of radio control.
Paris police plan extensive use of radio. Wireless telephony and airplanes gave Paris the quietest Mayday in history, enabling police groups to be shifted quickly to points wherever manifestations seemed to be concentrating. As a result, only a few insignificant street fights followed the annual Labour reunion, with no serious injuries.
The Australasian Wireless Review of January 1923. That same year, police wireless patrols began in Australia. In October, Fred Canning was a ship's wireless operator steaming down from Newcastle.
I was approaching Melbourne one night on my 8 to 12 watch, and I had been copying press for the benefit of the ship's crew at large, and what I got was an alarming story about rioting in Melbourne. Public rioting in streets, shops being smashed and looted, people being assaulted and beaten over the head, and all kinds of general trouble. The first question, of course, that arose was, where were the police? And it soon transpired that there were no police. The police had gone, uniformed police had gone as a body on strike. Well, for the first 24 hours, it was chaos. There was nothing to stop anybody taking what they wanted, and they duly did. They ransacked every shop they could break. The whole length of Swanston Street was littered with smashed plate glass, and so was Burke Street. The only thing the police could do, they took drastic action. They simply sacked the whole police force then and there. No man was ever re-employed, because he'd broken his oath of allegiance. And they all went out, and they set to work to recruit ordinary citizens as best they could to become special constables for the time being. Well, in the course of taking this press news down, I'd also heard for the first time in my life the human voice on radio. And that came in the form of a queer announcement that I couldn't account for. Somebody said, when the Morse was quiet, on the commercial frequency, somebody said, "Hello 268, hello 268, I have nothing to report, I have nothing to report, finish." And that was all I got. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but when I came to Melbourne and made inquiries and found that in fact I'd been listening to the first police radio, experimental transmissions. The 268 was intended to identify the one and only police car existing at that time, which was a very old, pre-war Hotchkiss car, open touring car, which I think had been pensioned off by the fire brigade and had then been bought by the police department.
Shortly before the police strike, the plainclothes division of the Victorian Police had started its night patrols. They kept in contact with headquarters by phoning Russell Street on the hour to see if they were needed anywhere.
This inspired the man who fathered the whole police radio business, whose vision started the whole thing, Senior Constable Fred Downey, who was once described later on by General Blamey when he became Chief Commissioner of Police as the most intelligent, uneducated man I ever met. And he was that. He is an ordinary, plainclothes policeman, but he had been out on this car on the Hotchkiss, cruising round, and one night he was cruising down in South Yarra, down to Main Road, and he became aware of the Melbourne radio station, an enormous mast, you see, a Balsillie mast sticking up out of the domain. And the idea crossed his mind, if only we could find some way of getting radio onto the car, we could get some messages, we could go to the job quickly instead of this terrible delay.
And he put the idea up, but he got back, and he was knocked back, and he fought for it, and he was knocked back. And this went on for quite a long time until suddenly it gelled when the police strike came along, and it suddenly clicked.
Because of the limited range of low-powered voice transmitters in 1923, the next stage of the Victorian Police Wireless Patrol was actually to revert back to Morse. But there was a shortage of police officers who knew Morse code.
Well, hearing this message during the actual strike, it whetted my appetite. And I thought, well, now perhaps here's a chance of getting away from the sea. And I was panting to get away from the sea because you know how it is with seagoing operators. If you stay there too long, you're there for life. You become unemployable. And as the only thing I had to offer was my Morse, I thought, well, I'll inquire about this. And I went up to the police station and asked, and they snapped at me. I was sort of looking for people like that, you see. So I resigned virtually from the sea then and there, and was enrolled as a plainclothes policeman and spent a little time in a barracks in Lonsdale Street, an ex-military barracks, which became a police depot during the strike, and did a little physical training and studied Paul's Police Offence Act. And presently I found myself equipped with a Webley 32 automatic in my pocket, and plainclothes, and in the car.
The first police wireless car could only receive. Fred Canning set out to devise a way to transmit from the car back to the base station at Russell Street. Because it hadn't been done before, there was little support for the idea. Canning and his colleagues had to beg and borrow bits and pieces to build the radio gear for the car from people like AWA.
After a lot of hesitation, the then Melbourne manager, Mr. Hook, he went on afterwards to become chief of AWA, but those ages, manager Melbourne branch, Mr. Hook agreed to lend us bits and pieces, provided we would be responsible for them and pay for them if we broke them. And on that basis, we got our first low-power transmitting valve, a Marconi. And from that, I scrounged around myself most of the time, and I found a Model T Ford ignition coil, an old second-hand one. And we came up with a transmitter which we were still not allowed to test. They wouldn't make available a car for us to test it in. We were just wildcat experimenters. We were just, we had no standing at all. So we again scrounged, and we found a gentleman named Mr. Craig, who was a salesman for Thornycroft's, the lorry people at those times. And Mr. Craig, a most public-spirited man, undertook to make his car available at night. He did his work all day and then drove around with us or the police all night in order to let us test this transmitter. And at first we were not very successful. He had a lot of weary nights and nothing much happened. But after a little while we began to get the hang of it to a certain extent, and the day came when Mr. Craig, cruising round somewhere down Brighton way, I think, came across a car smash in the early hours of the morning, and our operator with him was able to transmit the fact back to Russell Street that help was needed. That was the first message that ever was transmitted.
At first, the radio was only used at night, so the gear and antenna was installed in the car each evening before the patrol began at 10 o'clock.
The understanding was that the driver and the operator always stayed with the car to maintain communication. The men would take off in all directions. We actually did very little mileage in those days. In fact, I think an unofficial rule was laid down that we were not normally to exceed 25 miles in any one shift. So, of course, the standard patrol procedure was for the car to pick a district which was a likely hunting ground and park the car at the end of a long street, say something like Chapel Street in Prahran, and leave the car there with the operator and the driver, and the men would take off down the street, some on each side, testing all the shop fronts and looking for signs of trouble and so on, peering into alleyways and generally looking for trouble and seeing if they could pick up any chaps who shouldn't be there. Any pedestrian out in those small hours was liable to be stopped and questioned. What was he doing there? And what have you got in that bag? So that was the ordinary way of patrol. They didn't do much mileage. If the men discovered anything down the street a long way off, they'd flash torches on a code arrangement. The driver always had to be on watch, and he'd take off like hell and pick them up. And the same with the operator. If the wireless man got a message, what we had to do then was to turn on the headlights, flash the thing like mad, take off after the crew, pick them up, and go off to where we were wanted. So 2 men always had to stay in the car, driver and operator. They never got out. But the others were doing very largely foot patrol all the time.
D24. From the files of the Victoria Police come these true stories of unceasing war against crime, of day and night vigilance that protects our life and our property, and of the nerve center of the Police Information Bureau, D24. This is the true story of the taxi assaults.
We had the police dog called Bully, a big black bull terrier. The general theory was that if you ran across any crooks and you couldn't catch them, you send Bully after them and he bailed them up. And he was a fearsome-looking object when he was really stirred up. He opened his jaws, he got a mouthful of teeth, and he looked really formidable. Well, in those days, there was a famous criminal loose in Melville called Squizzy Taylor. And Squizzy was a very artful customer indeed, and very hard to pin anything on him. He thumbed his nose at the police all the time, constantly. He was very proud of himself and his ability to get away with things. And he swaggered about the place, an evil little squat figure, just making fools of us half the time. There was a cafe in Exhibition Street, Melbourne, at that time called the Shanghai. It was open all night, a Chinese cafe. And it became known as a haunt of all-night criminals. And they would go in there for drinks and a snack and so on, and confabulation. So the police quite frequently called in there just to see who was there and what was going on. They had nothing to go on, but just to see what was doing. And one night they called at the Shanghai at about 2 a.m, and the driver stayed in the car, and I stayed in the car, and Bully stayed in the car. Who should stroll out of the Shanghai but Squizzy Taylor? And he strolled nonchalantly across the road from the cafe to the car, leaned his hands on the side of the car and said, "Hello, boys, how's things?" Saw Bully in front of next to the driver, and he leaned out and patted Bully on the head. And Bully fawned on him, absolutely fawned on him, loved him. Thought Squizzy was a lovely man. Our faces were so red. This was our famous savage police dog that would take on any criminal. Well, we let Squizzy get away with that one, but later on he paid the penalty. Squizzy was ultimately murdered.
And Mr. Ralph Traeger, tell us, you were the very first person to put the sound on the air, I think, with Dr. John Flynn.
Well, this takes us back to 1929 when the first base station was installed at Cloncurry, and the sets were these little pedal sets in those days, and they weren't able to talk. They had to talk by Morse. They were dotted in various places. The furthest one that year was Birdsville, which is about 400 miles from Cloncurry, and they had regular communication.
And was this all clear sound?
No, this was clear sound from the base, but it was Morse from the pedal sets, and some of that Morse wasn't so good because they weren't Morse operators.
When did words come on instead of Morse?
Oh, that was several years later. I think the first telephone pedal set was used in about 1934, 35.
Alf Traeger was an Adelaide radio engineer. He designed the pedal wireless, which enabled remote homesteads to contact John Flynn's flying doctor. One person who recollected meeting Flynn was Phil Muldoon from Newcastle Waters.
During the night, the conversation centred around the activities of the Flying Doctor Service. In the course of this conversation, John Flynn assured my wife and myself that we had no need to fear, even though we were in an isolated part, as the Flying Doctor Service meant the mantle of safety for all such people as us. He went on to say that it was only a matter if we got sick and felt that we needed the attention of a doctor or hospitals, that we could send an urgent wire in the morning to the Flying Doctor Base in Cloncurry, and in the evening the plane would be at Newcastle Waters to pick us up. At the time, I told Dr. Flynn that I doubted very much this was possible because the planes were very small that were in operation those days, and the distances was great, and the limit to these planes was small as far as distance was concerned. I did not realize at the time that within the next 12 months I would be the first man from the far out west to avail myself of the opportunity of the Flying Doctor Service in planes. I was on a patrol in the MacArthur River district on the Barclay Tablelands when I was taken suddenly ill. Eventually I was conveyed to Brunette Down Station, where contact was made over the wireless station there with the Flying Doctor Base in Cloncurry. And the plane arrived that evening, I'm told afterwards, because at this particular time I was unconscious. The following morning the plane left for Cloncurry, and the pilot of the plane was a well-known man called Captain Affleck. The doctor's name I just can't recall. However, after we got up in the air, it appears that I became pretty unruly and took to the doctor, and the doctor had to call on Captain Affleck to come to his aid. And during this incident, I became worse, and they decided when over Camberwell in Western Queensland to come down there on the aerodrome, which was immediately in front of the hospital and adjacent to the cemetery. The Flying Doctor said, I think we'll give him a go here because I don't think he'll live very long. However, I remained 13 days unconscious and eventually came through. I'm quite satisfied that if it were not for the Flying Doctor Service, the foresight of John Flynn and all those men that went to help to make up the Flying Service and make it possible, and with God's blessing, I would not be here today to tell this story.
I think you who've been following our progress and interruptions to progress out there would be glad to hear something of the atmosphere of that lonely land as it has been modified by the wireless transmission side of the Flying Doctor Service of Australia.
John Flynn speaking over the ABC just after the war.
Now, you may have heard people discussing this service in the past, rather bitterly criticizing it because the neighbors could hear your business. There may be times, especially if you're interested in things that other people want to know about particularly, there may be times when you would rather they didn't know your business. But other people, and you may be amongst them, don't realize that in most things, the knowledge your neighbors have of what you are doing and what you are talking about is a safeguard to you. For instance, about 3 or 4 weeks before we came to Inaminka, we had ordered a 44-gallon drum of petrol to be sent up on the mail to Inaminka so that it would be awaiting us on our arrival. When we got there was no petrol. And when we made inquiries, we found the mail had not been coming through, and our petrol was probably still in Broken Hill. But not long after, that is during the next day or two, we learned from the chatter of the people talking over their little pedal transmitters, we learned that the people along the track, knowing that our petrol had gone astray, had made arrangements for us to get one lot of petrol in the first place we came to, and the balance of 44 gallons at the next place we came to. Well, now, I just give you that in passing as one example of the good neighbor policy made possible by this chatter, which allows people to know your needs as well as your secrets.
Tonight we tell of the advance of learning in the empty spaces of Australia as we present Education in the Outback.
The story of the School of the Air, which is broadcast to children of the Northern Territory, Western Australia, and the isolated areas here in South Australia. One of of the major problems of the people of the outback has been the educating of their children. For so scattered are the various stations that it is impossible to establish schools, and only in the more settled areas are there educational facilities. Until recently, the children received school lessons by correspondence only, with their mothers supervising their learning. But with the advance of radio, many of these children are now able to hear teachers from Alice Springs broadcasting over the Flying Doctor Network.
YP portable, Yoke Peter portable.
The School of the Air was started by Adelaide Meathker, a former inspector of girls' schools in South Australia. She was also involved with the Royal Flying Doctor Service.
There came a day when a sister from the Alice Springs Hospital suggested a health talk to mothers over the network. This proved most successful, so much so that it suggested the idea of the outback as a community rather than as separate individuals. Immediately came the idea, what about the children? How about gathering together the outback children as a community and helping them with their lessons? How about a School of the Air? Could it be done? It could. 3 months of experimental work, collaboration between officers of the Flying Doctor Service and education authorities, especially the director of the base and the head teacher at Alice Springs, has shown that the idea can materialize as a practical project, is developing, in fact, rather dramatically. Over the Flying Doctor Network come the friendly voices of various teachers stationed at the Alice Springs School, reaching into the homes scattered across the distance, bringing personal help for the education of the children out back.
This is X-Ray Love. X-Ray Love. X-Ray Love calling 8US. X-Ray Love calling 8US. Good morning, Mr. Pitts. How are you today? And how's the weather at Alice Springs?
8US to X-Ray Love. 8US to X-Ray Love. Receiving you quite well. I'm well, thank you. And it's pretty hot here in Alice Springs. Now, would all stations please stand by for the School of the Air?
Dennis? Dennis, where are you? The lesson's about to start.
Here I am, Mum. I was just getting my books and pencils.
Oh, that's a good boy. You don't want to miss this morning's lesson, do you?
Oh, no, Mum. Golly, I wouldn't miss it for anything. I wish it was on every day.
Well, it may be soon. And maybe it won't be so very long before you'll be able to hear everything the girls and boys in Alice Springs learn every day.
Golly, won't that be good? Gee, it'll be just like going to school, won't it, Mum?
Yes, Dennis, it'll be wonderful. The correspondence lessons, together with the School of the Air, teach you quite a lot. Why, before you know where you are, you'll be quite an educated young man. Oh, goodness me, look at the time. It's almost 10. Here we are, chatting away. Sit down at the table, Dennis, and get all your things ready.
In some locations, these small radio stations took on a strategic role. During the Second World War, Beryl Adams and her husband ran a coast-watching station on Croker Island, northeast of Darwin.
We had the treadle sets. We had to treadle like mad and gasp in between and give the messages over of what the weather was like, how many planes we'd seen, if we'd seen any boats, or anything unusual. We had a code which was changed every month, and we had to sit down and work that out before we went on the treadle wireless. Now, that went on for 24 hours. Towards the end, about 1944, we had several planes come down on the island. One was a great big American, it had about a dozen men on it. My husband had to go up with the boys and have a look at that plane and take the bodies that were there out. They managed to rescue 2 people who got parachutes and come down, who would have died but for the fact that help was at hand, and the Aborigines brought them back down to the island. And several crashes we had to go up and find out if there were any survivors. when the American plane went down, they overwhelmed us with kindness, actually, and big boats came in and we were well and truly looked after.
They offered you some food, didn't they?
Yes. They offered us some food. Were we wanting anything? And I said, oh, I'd love some steak. And they sent us in a half side of frozen beef. Oh, dear. We looked at this great big quart of beef and wondered how we managed. But one of the boys knew how to cut up a leg, and once it unfroze, it was no use us trying to keep it because we only had kerosene fridges. And so we all really had a feast. But the thing that we really loved was ice cream. We had, ice cream, you might manage it sometimes, but not very much. But they sent us in a bucket, and that was overwhelming. But it was really lovely.
Did you ever hear any of these air battles going on?
No. When in 1940, when the Japanese were bombing Darwin, we would count 18, 20 planes going over, and coming back, you would count the same number so that you know that they were either gone or there was one or two missing. And we did the same with our own. Once our own flights began to come and retaliate, we would count and say the number and the type of plane.
When you first saw these large numbers of Japanese planes going over and reported to Darwin, what was Darwin's reaction to that?
Just the ordinary business-like, thank you, your report has been received and will be dealt with. That was about the standard reply. But we ourselves, especially if the Japanese came down a little bit low to find out what was going on, we took to the bush.
In Calling All Cars, you heard Fred Canning, Alf Traeger, Phil Muldoon, John Flynn, Adelaide Mithke and Beryl Adams. In the final program, Australia Calling, we'll hear about the origins of our shortwave broadcasting service. Thanks to the National Film and Sound Archive and Crawford Productions for the excerpts from the 1935 serial D24, and to ABC Radio Archives for the excerpts about the Royal Flying Doctor Service and the School of the Air. Ros Bowden recorded the interview with Beryl Adams. Music for the series was written and performed by Kathy Peters, and production of Bright Sparks by Sharon Davis, Peter McLeod and Stephen Rapley for the ABC's Social History Unit.
Australia calling. Hello, America. Australia calls you to hear Mr. Walter Gledhill, President of the American Society.
The ABC Social History Unit presents the final program in the series, Bright Sparks, Australian Radio Stories, compiled by Stephen Rapley.
In the early 1920s, while public attention focused on the new broadcasting stations, wireless experimenters, including the Marconi Company, started exploring shortwaves. Shortwave communication was seen as a way of reducing Australia's isolation from the rest of the world, especially Great Britain. The special attraction of radio links was that, unlike cables, they couldn't be easily cut by an enemy in wartime. One of the first engineers at AWA to explore the high frequencies of shortwave radio was Sidney Newman.
In March 1924, my employer, AWA, sent me to Mr. Fish, later Sir Ernest, home at Vaucluse, with a second station at Willoughby, to listen for shortwave transmissions on 92 metres being sent from the Marconi experimental station at Poldhu, England. And to our astonishment, we successfully received the signals. It was on the 10th of November 1924 that we sent the first Morse signals from this country to England, and in April 1925 I was given the job of developing and installing a shortwave transmitter and receiver on the steamship Niagara with duplicate equipment at Pennant Hills radio station, which proved so successful with daily Morse signals on the voyage to Vancouver and back that it created worldwide interest.
Shortwaves were attractive because they covered a greater distance at less cost. Early in 1927, AWA launched the high-speed radio telegraph service called the Beam Wireless System. In September that year, 2FC organised the first Empire broadcast over AWA's experimental shortwave station, VK2ME, at Pennant Hills near Sydney. Gwen Gibson from 2FC.
Of all the programmes that were most exciting that I was associated with, was the first world broadcast, carried out by 2FC in conjunction with AWA and relayed by the BBC. We went on duty at 9 o'clock on Sunday night. 2:30 on Monday morning, artists and staff sang with great gusto, Advance Australia Fair. And we had a beam message back to say we were being successfully received. Prime Minister Bruce spoke from Dandenong, the concert programme proceeded, and we finished up at 5:30.
The reception in London was very good. The whole programme was rebroadcast by the BBC, and press reports were most enthusiastic. For instance, the Morning Post considered, quote, it was one of the most remarkable experiments in the history of broadcasting.
Eric Burberry. There were 4 more Empire broadcasts before the end of the year, and all this was 5 years before the British began their own Empire service.
This is London calling. London calling the Australasian zone through GSD 11,750 kilocycles, 25...
AWA's shortwave stations continued their test broadcasts. Radio historian Philip Jeeves was a broadcaster at Sydney station VK2ME in the early 30s.
We used to operate it from Sydney using one of 2CH's studios. The transmitter was at Pennant Hills. It operated on 31.28 metres. It was a very high-powered transmitter, and it went out to the world. It was the voice of Australia in those days, and it was the equivalent at that time of what Radio Australia is today. And various announcers, trusted ones only, I might say, were given the opportunity of running the programs on VK2ME, and also, and this was very rewarding, reading the mail that eventually came in from people in all countries. And you got a sense of the enormous power of radio and its ability to communicate with people in far distant places.
By the end of the 1930s, listeners worldwide had become fascinated with shortwave broadcasters. There was a particular interest in the strong signals from the German propaganda stations. A month after the Second World War began, John Curtin described Australia as the silent Susie of the Pacific. He argued the case for Australian broadcasts in Japanese, Dutch, Chinese and other languages to refute enemy propaganda. By the 20th of December 1939, Australia was on the air.
This is the first shortwave national broadcast conducted by the Australian government. I am speaking to you as Prime Minister of Australia. Our reason for establishing broadcasts of this kind may be quite simply stated. In brief, we have decided that over some of the propaganda stations to which you listen, so many strange things are said, not only about Australia, but about the whole of the British Empire, that the time has come to speak for ourselves.
Yes, I was the controller of the Overseas Broadcasting Service from January or February 1940 until, I think, the end of April 1944.
William McMahon Ball, former ABC commentator.
A war was on. And however much you may deplore it, we were largely a propaganda service. We were trying to tell the world what a wonderful country Australia was, what a wonderful pride we had in lining up, first of all, with the United Kingdom, and of course, with the outbreak of the Pacific War, lining up with the United States, how proud we were of our allies, what wonderful allies they were, how they stood for freedom, civilization, and everything else, and how very unpleasant the enemy countries were. We tried, and with some success, I think, to avoid the crudest types of propaganda, the crudest types that indulged in trying to distinguish between races and speaking of the Japanese as an inferior race. We did everything in our power to avoid that kind of thing. But undoubtedly, our news commentaries and our talks were propaganda. They were strongly biased in favour of the Allies against the enemy.
The listening post was literally one room. We had 3 knobs to turn to get alternative programs, 2 or 3 programs on the landlines, and 1 typewriter and some headphones, and that was it.
Helen Ferber was one of the first to work at the Australian Shortwave listening post in Melbourne. Their job was to monitor broadcasts from enemy countries. Finding out what the other side was claiming about the war was the first step in preparing our own broadcasts.
Of course, you've got to remember that in those days there were no tape recorders and no satellites, and when you listened, you 9 times out of 10 got terrible static and was struggling to hear, what was being said behind the static. We did most of our listening in the evening and overnight because the reception was better. But it was quite hard making the rosters, which was a job which fell to me, because you had to use your scarce resources of, for instance, interpreters for the Asian languages to cover the most important broadcasts from Japan and other places occupied by the Japanese. And then you had to match your European languages to the best times for receiving from Berlin or Rome or somewhere like that.
As well as gathering material for the programmers of the shortwave service, the monitors at the listening post were also hunting for more strategic information.
There were a couple of broadcasts from Berlin radio which were beamed to this area. In other words, they were not stuff that would be picked up by listening posts in Britain or Delhi or the United States. And it was very important for us to get those. One was a news broadcast, and it was no doubt intended for people on merchant raiders and things like that. Another was messages to seamen. And we had to get those verbatim because they wanted, the services wanted to analyse them. And so the only recording means in the early stages was to cut a 78 RPM acetate record. And of course, when you played it back, you turned the machine off, it ground to a halt, you typed up that sentence, then you turned it on and had to find your blooming place and so forth. It was a ghastly procedure. I have to tell a joke about myself. My very first week at the Listening Post, I was told, go up to the ABC, which was in on Russell Street, and they'll make this recording for you, and you transcribe it up there on their machines. And they made the tape, and they put it on the playback, and I sat down, and it went... So I solemnly went out and said to the ABC technician, you've given me the Japanese one, not the German one. It turned out I'd got it on the wrong speed. But after that I learnt my lesson, and I quickly, after Japan came to the war, could distinguish Japanese from almost anything. They tried to make out that Australia was the orphan of the Pacific, and they emphasised our dependence on the United States and called us the 49th state of the Union, there being only 48 at that stage instead of the present 50. I don't think the Germans presupposed a great listening public in Australia, and the Japanese probably wouldn't have had any listeners at all, given the very few shortwave sets there were in the country and the very bad reception most of the time, the dreadful static. But they got the idea, which had been used by the Germans in World War I, of including broadcasts of letters or messages from our prisoners of war in their hands in broadcasts so as to induce people to listen. And they were very successful. There were something like 30,000 Australians in Japanese hands, and their relatives had no news of them whatever. Didn't know whether they'd been sunk or killed or whether they were prisoners. So, of course, as soon as the Japanese started these prisoner of war messages, the word got around, and people came flocking to the listening post. They'd heard about the listening post. What can you tell us about these broadcasts? Well, we, of course, were monitoring them very carefully. We were using our precious Edison wax cylinders to record them. We were noting them as we recorded them in case they didn't record perfectly. And we were passing the messages on, as instructed, to the military services, because only they could check the names and the service numbers of the people involved. So we weren't allowed to give these messages to the poor people who came to us. And that meant that they started, buying shortwaves, clubbing together to buy shortwave sets. And some people whose relative was in prison and was a prisoner and was broadcast would get telephone calls and letters from all over Australia from people who'd heard the broadcast and said, we heard this from your husband, from your son, from your brother. So they were getting these garbled reports, and it was very hard to get the names right, sometimes because of the static.
After a bureaucratic battle, the names of POWs broadcast by the Japanese were eventually passed on to relatives.
Sometimes the Japanese even interlarded something themselves, and we could identify that fairly readily because they did things like refer to Nippon and the Nipponese, which no Australian would have used. They'd have said the Japs and Japan. But one letter that was broadcast was from the late Rowan Rivett, who was an Australian journalist, to his then wife. And he went on and on about the beautiful tropical surroundings and so forth. And then he said, truly, this is a land where every prospect pleases. And, of course, to judge by the pleased tone with which the Japanese announcer gave this message, it was clear he thought this was a great compliment. But, of course, most Australians would know that I think it's a line from a hymn, ended, where every prospect pleases and only man is vile. And, of course, the Japanese didn't know that. And they were very pleased at the compliment,
On to victory!
September 1938.
Munich, Germany, the United Kingdom...
Hetty Hurst worked at the listening post. She'd left Austria in 1938.
When I came here, I had no passport, of course, because I had lost my Austrian nationality, and the police regarded me as an enemy alien. And so, as an enemy alien, and war broke out, we were not allowed to leave Auburn, where I lived in South Hawthorne, East Hawthorne, without permission. We needed a permission even to visit people in Camberwell. And when I went for my job, I got a permission to go to Essendon because that was the place of my work. And my husband got permission to go to town because that's where he worked. And the funny thing, of course, was when I worked on highly classified material and confidential material and so on that wasn't given to the press or anybody, I still was an enemy alien and had to get permission from the Auburn police station to go to Collins Street to listen to that material.
So it was a Friday afternoon when McMahon Ball called me into his office and said, would you put up a notice on the board saying any mention of enemy naval activity in Australian waters to be reported at once to Commander Long? And McMahon Ball said to me, now, this is not to be put in the notice, but what has happened is that a German merchant raider has sunk a Sydney off the coast of Western Australia. And he said, we don't know whether the survivors on the Cormoran, which was then sunk by the Sydney, were able to radio before they were shipwrecked to Germany. They hadn't admitted anything. So I went back and I put the notice on any naval movements, etc., to be reported to Commander Long, and I kept a tight lip about the rest. But it was a Friday, and a number of us were going for a holiday up near Hillsville just for the weekend. And my mother had a bit of her petrol ration left, which was a great treat, and she said she'd take 1 carload. So we were driving along Friday night, and Mum says, wasn't that awful, Mac, about the Sydney? And Mac looked daggers at me, had I gone straight from swearing secrecy and rung my mum with the story. But he just said, oh, what was that? And Mum said, oh, didn't you know she was sunk off the coast of Western Australia with all hands? Merchant raider. And McMahon Ball said, where did you hear that? And she said, oh, I was at a lunch of naval wives today, and she said they were all terribly distressed because, of course, they knew the wives of the captain and the officer, and all of them were lost. So much for security. It's a terrible story to tell, but it was true.
This is the Australian Broadcasting Commission's field unit with the AIF. The Brook has been relieved. It has now passed into the category of history.
They call us the Rats of the Brook, but we can still sing, and here's our opening number, Bless 'Em All. Cheer up, my lads, and the hall, there's love in the shore and the fall. There'll be no promotion this side of the ocean, so cheer up, my lads, and the hall. That'll be the day when the troop ships are heading back for good old Aussie, and we march down Martin Place in our victory parade. Yes, I can see the scene now. There'll be the Prime Minister, the Minister for the Army, and all the other big shots. And the Minister for the Army will say, now, Mr. Prime Minister, here's the 6th Division from Libya and Greece. And here's the 7th Division from Syria. And here's the 8th Division who went to Malaya, and the Armoured Division, and all the militia boys. And the Prime Minister will say, but didn't we have a 9th Division? The Army Minister will say, hell yes, I forgot. They're still in Tobruk.
While the shortwave service broadcast Australia's view of the war to the rest of the world, the ABC's field recording unit brought the war back home. Len Edwards was one of the engineers recording the war correspondence reports directly onto acetate discs. The discs were sped back to Australia to be broadcast.
Some of the discs were 16 inches in diameter. They're fairly big discs, and the equipment was very, very heavy. The first equipment we had it weighed about 400 pounds, and this was quite impossible to cart around in the field. Yeah. You had to depend on all sorts of different modes of transport and other people to help all the time. But the gear was very, very heavy, and it was very, very bulky. The first equipment we took out was, it was about 2 feet square, cubed in an amplifier, and the same thing in the disc cutting equipment. And then there was the 12-volt accumulators and the power inverters, which converted the battery power up to the 240 volts AC to run the equipment. So it was all very, very heavy and cumbersome and almost impossible to cart around unless you had proper transport. But transport was another thing, of course. We had to have motor transport or native carriers or somebody to help all the time, and this was very inhibiting as far as getting into places where you could really do good recordings, and it was very inhibiting from the point of view of getting into forward areas where you could really get actuality recordings, and that was the object of the thing, of course, to get actuality recordings.
Hello, BBC.
This is Chester Wilmot speaking at 30 seconds to 9 o'clock on the evening of March the 23rd. In 30 seconds from now, the buffaloes carrying the assaulting troops will begin to cross the Rhine. The Rhine is now dark. The surface guns and the machine guns which were firing...
One in particular was when we had to carry it up. We had to carry it in behind a tank that was going forward. And you'd creep up behind this tank, shelter behind the tank, and then when the tank took off, you'd have to duck into a shell hole. And so we ducked into a shell hole and set up this gear. And then, I don't know whether we got seen or not, but anyhow, a few mortars started dropping around, and that was when the equipment got some shrapnel in it, and so that finished that one.
Bill McFarlane worked with the first field recording unit with correspondents like Chester Wilmot.
Quite often, if you went into an artillery area, you might be able to bring your vehicle up, and you might have to carry it in under cover of darkness, so you'd have to sort of stumble along as best you could, and then set up, you see, and Chester invariably wanted to go wherever the action was. So, and if that was right up forward, well, that was where you had to operate. In those days, it didn't worry me at all because I was relatively young, and no, it was never a problem.
This is the Australian Broadcasting Commission's field unit with the AIF in Greece. When the Germans drove through into the plain round Salonika, Australian troops were holding an important pass which led southwards from Salonika. Through this pass, there was only one road, but over it, Greek and Allied forces, which had been operating in the plain, were withdrawn to stronger positions in the mountains. Behind them, but in front of the Germans, the road was to be blown up. Our sound truck, manned by Chester Wilmot and Bill McFarlane, waited all day long with the engineers who were to do the blowing up, and in the recording they made, you will hear the story of the day's incidents recorded on the spot. The engineers did a good job. In fact, they did so well that when the charge went off, the explosion blew us off the air. The truck shook and the cutting head lifted. And so you won't hear the noise of the actual explosion, but only the sound of hundreds of tons of earth crashing to the bottom of the gully. And now, here is the story of blowing the road.
Holding up this pass most of the day, there's been a fairly chill wind, and as a matter of fact, it's so cold that the soft acetate discs on which we make these recordings virtually froze up. And when we first started to make a recording, the discs were too hard for the sapphire to cut them. And the result has been that for the last half hour, our engineer, Bill McFarlane, has been hugging a disc to his chest with my greatcoat over the disc and trying his best to get it warm. There may be some background noise in this disc, but if it is, you'll know that it's because the weather here has made these discs a little colder than they should be. Well, we've had to wait rather longer than we anticipated for the blowing up of this part of the road because they had to wait till the last of the Greek artillery got through. It's now midnight and it's absolutely dead quiet in the valley. It was absolutely dead quiet in the valley. But since then, things have been disturbed a little. As you heard, there was rather a vast commotion, and rather earlier than we anticipated, the whole caboose went up, and there was rocks flying everywhere all around us, and as a matter of fact, they landed so near that we had to run for the shelter of the bank.
Battles, of course, were very difficult things to record because they're spread over large areas usually, and you'd only get one very small section of it. You get plenty of background noise, of course, but that doesn't mean anything. Meant very little. But you could also get comments of the people who were in the actual area at the time. That was okay. Or you could get the sound of aircraft, dive bombers, and the bombs coming in and exploding, that sort of thing. Those things were no problem, but it was very difficult to get what you'd call a battle. You'd only get small sections.
And here now is a recording which we've made of the post when it's actually in action.